to go ahead and kick us off. So as I say every single Friday for what some people have dubbed our Rage Fridays, white Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to our democracy. And each of you who are here in person or online are advocating for democracy and fighting fascism just by showing up today. It is an act of resistance, and we're going to need a lot of that in 2025 and the years beyond. So thank you all for standing up and being part of that resistance and being part of those individuals who are fighting fascism. Now, you might be wondering why Secular AZ is partnering with a religious organization and using their church for this event. And it's because simply we absolutely need to partner with our faithful brothers and sisters in religious organizations that share our values if we want to preserve our democracy. So with that, I would also like to say thank you to Shadow Rock Church. I mean, isn't this a beautiful space, y'all? It's just gorgeous here. And when I came here to speak, I don't know, a month or two ago, I was like, this is where we should have the summit. So thank you all for coming into a religious space and joining us today, and none of you spontaneously combusted. Good job. So I'd like to thank Pastor Ken Heinzleman. Did I say that right, Pastor Ken? Is it Heinzleman? Okay, good. We've got Roy Zabrowski who helped, and unfortunately, I don't know Phil or John's last names, but they were here several days, just making sure that the technology was all set and ready to go. So thank you. Let's give Shadow Rock UCC Church a big round of applause, please. So you may remember that our theme last year was about supporting our rural freethinkers. And this year, our theme is building bridges. We simply must support our progressive religious neighbors. This year, one of our fastest growing demographics is people who consider themselves religious or spiritual, but they feel as though they're adrift, as their religious leaders have become more extreme and their churches resemble extremist political rallies instead of a worship service. Now, unfortunately, our progressive churches are dying. As a matter of fact, I used to, long time ago, attend the West Valley Unitarian Universalist Church. It's no longer, I mean, the building's still there, but the congregation just kind of fizzled out. And you'll see that, you know, now when you drive around, you'll probably notice all of these churches that are small progressive denominations of churches that are just empty. So we really need to support them, because while they're dying, these mega churches have become an extension of fundamentalist, extremist elected officials and political campaigns. At this point, I'd like to start with a little moment of reflection about the passing of President Jimmy Carter. I meant to do this at our first annual Festival of Pies that we had last weekend, and I was so kind of in the moment that I forgot. But I'd like to just start with a little reflection. You know, somebody asked me, like I said at the last event, to give a little tribute, and I was task mastering, so I kind of forgot. So if anyone at a national level has shown us how one can live and govern through their faith and their beliefs, but without ever promoting or ostracizing others who do not share their beliefs, it was President Carter. So for today, I say let's channel his kindness, his openness, and his acceptance of everyone, those of faith and of none. So with that, buckle up, secular fam. There will be lots of knowledge being dropped today, and our first speaker is, first, before we do that, actually, can we flip through the slide? If you want to take a picture of this, this just kind of gives you a little schedule of what we've got going on today. Our lunch will be at noon, from noon to 12:30. So if you'd like to take a picture, like I said, that is going to be our agenda for today. But first, I would like to introduce an Arizona treasure. Dianne Post has served as legal director and board member at large for Secular AZ since 2016. She was a family lawyer in Arizona for 18 years, representing mostly battered women and abused children before beginning a career in international law, primarily doing gender-based violence work. So with that, please, let's give Dianne Post a round of applause.
morning, and it's great to see you all here. And I started out my day by going to the wrong place. And when I got there at the Humanist Center, I went, oh, it's not here this year. Okay, so we're going to the next one. Okay, next slide. All right, so next slide. All right, so this year we had, next, 63 complaints. And as you can see by the slide, 21 of them were schools. So when I say complaints, I mean someone reported to us what they thought was a violation. It can be a phone call, an email, something that comes through the web, any number of things, ways that these complaints get to me. And then we investigate it and we see if it is in fact a violation and then decide what it is we're going to do about it. All right, so this year we had 21 schools that we had complaints about, and then there were 12 government, and you can see down below the types of government agencies that we were dealing with, and 20 churches. And we expected that because this being an election year, there's all kind of illegal campaigning going on at churches. And many, many, many of these complaints were about that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that a bit later. And so any questions about any of that, how we get our complaints or what we do with them when we get them? No. All right. So look at the previous years. We had 63 last year, exactly the same number. And then you can see by the previous years, we had 2 years in the 30s, 4 years actually, between 27 and 34. And then we had the first 2 years, which I started in 2016, which was 17 and 18. And so then they jumped up. Now notice how they jumped. Can anybody think of why they would have jumped in the years that they jumped? Why? It was election years and political campaigns and the rising of the fascists that we're seeing today. Next. Now, we had some successes and more losses this year than we have had in the past. And that is really, I think, because many of the governments, like city and county governments all around the state that we would contact, or schools in the rural areas particularly that we would contact, didn't even respond. Whereas before they always responded, maybe not appropriately, but they responded. Now they don't, because they're not afraid. Because they know the IRS is not going to come after them. They know we don't have the ability to sue them, nor the possibility of winning in court. So they are heightened in their denial or in their violations of the Constitution because they know there's no sanctions for them and they know that they're in power and we're not. We did have some successes. Apache Junction revised their invocation policy, although they still have one. It is at least within the national requirements, and of course I can't do anything about that. We had a school that did counsel a teacher about, she had harassed a student who refused to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, which you don't have to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. And she was harassing that student and she was made to stop and discipline, et cetera. Another one made a boy turn his t-shirt inside out because she didn't like the political saying that was on the front of the t-shirt, which of course you can't do that either. So that was another one. And then one pastor from a small church called me and said, I didn't know I couldn't do this. Thank you very much for contacting me. I got, what? So that was kind of an interesting call. But in some of our losses, Camp Verde, some of you might remember back in 2019, we're starting a Bible study class in school, which is completely forbidden, of course. Then COVID came, and so it didn't happen. Well, they started it. They've now started it. This is the second or third year of it, and somebody who was going and their kid went and found this to be offered in school. I have two national forums, both Americans United for Separation of Church and State and FFRF, will sue if I could find a plaintiff. I can't find a plaintiff. There's many people up there who have complained. Nobody will be a plaintiff because of the fear. It's a small town, it's very violent. And then in 2019, when we had this situation come up, the two who complained, one's car was keyed and the other one had the back window shut out. So people are just not going to complain. So if I can never find a plaintiff, we can bring the suit. But at this point, they actually, the attorney they had back in 2019, they fired him because he told them I was right and they were wrong. So they fired him and got one who would agree with them. All right, next slide. Oh, I left off the Peoria. Oh, the Peoria case, that's going to be heard next week on the 9th in the federal court. It's at the district court level. The issue with that was the FFRF and Secular Coalition submitted an amicus brief, which is a friend of the court brief, and we were rejected. The court rejected the brief. Now, that's not that unusual because it was in district court, which is not common to have amicus briefs. And there's no actual procedure in the law to submit an amicus brief in a district court. There is an appellate court, but not in the district court. So it wasn't that surprising. But it also wasn't that surprising because the judge happens to be one that the Liberty Council, what's the name of that group, Jeannie? Liberty something. Liberty Legal had endorsed as a judge, so he's not going to be on our side. So he rejected our brief, but it's ready, and depending upon what happens at the district court level, it'll be ready for when the appeal goes, and that's next week going to be heard, and then it'll be a couple months before we know the answer. And then the third, again, a loss, was in Show Low, where the school, again, their own attorney told them they were wrong, and they just kept on doing it. They're harassing a child who was at the time in middle school, now she's in high school. And so even though their own attorney told them were wrong, they just kept on doing the same thing and not giving any assistance to her or the family or stopping the bullying that was going on. So they've had to hire an attorney to sue and take care of that. Okay, now we're in the next one. All right. ADOC, that's the Department of Corrections, they did admit that they did not have sufficient spiritual people for the Muslims that are in prison, which there are many of them. I don't know if we can take credit for this. The Paradise Valley didn't sign that agreement with the LDS, but we will anyway. And a funny one, you'll love this. Turning Point USA, I filed a complaint against them because of a mump rally that went on in one of the churches, right? And they then sent a letter back, and they threatened all kinds of things. Oh, they're going to sue me, they're going to disbar me, they're going to do all these kinds of things, right? Well, after I got over being angry, I researched everything, of course. They had not one shred of a case, not one single shred of a case. Okay, so I wrote up my response. And then just at the end, I thought, who is this attorney? I don't know this attorney. So I looked this attorney up, and at the time she sent the letter, she was suspended and could not practice law. So you can imagine how fast I sent that complaint to the State Bar of Arizona. And they did move quickly, and they suspended her even longer and gave her a big fine. Did I hear from Turning Point anymore? No, I have not heard back from Turning Point at all, and I hope that I never do. Okay. All right, I already said the other stuff there, that they're just not responding because they know they're in ascendant. All right, any questions about what we're doing or how we're doing it? No? All right, next one. In addition to all of these complaints in Arizona and the ones that I listed, the 20 churches that we did about wrongful election campaigning, Lindsay was also very busy with many complaints that came in through the website from around the country, not just Arizona, but around the country, complaining about churches doing wrongful electioneering during campaign season. And as you may or may not know, on our website, we have a do-it-yourself complaint. How to do it, where to do it, the procedure to do it, the forms to do it. So she referred all of these 51 complaints came from around the country to our little website. So we are getting this information out there, which is a very good thing. Next. In addition, we had a couple of trainings this year. Last year at the State Bar Convention, our discussion was censorship in schools. Has the law turned into a tool of oppression? And we had about 27 attendees, which is half of what we had the previous year. However, the attendance at the bar convention in general was in half, which was a very sad statement about our Arizona State Bar, because the whole content of the bar convention in 2024 was the Brown versus Board of Education decision and racism and that sort of thing. The president of the State Bar was African American, and the whole focus was on that. We had Ruby Bridges was there, and we had also the people that were the plaintiffs in the Brown versus Board of Education case, et cetera, and the attendance was half of what it had been in previous years. What does that tell you about the lawyers in Arizona? Nothing good, nothing good. So I think it was 27 that we had in our workshop, and they did stay for the whole time. And every year I hope that from this I will get volunteers, I will get donations, I never get anything. And that's what happened last year too. All right, so this year I have in a proposal, and I haven't heard yet, which is quite amazing. The proposal this year is about book banning. So I suspect that it's the topic that is causing them to figure out how they're going to deny me. It's really what I think. I thought they'd deny me last year, and I was surprised when they approved it. So this year we'll see. I haven't heard yet. And normally in January, you have to start turning in your materials. And so I thought, I haven't even heard yet, and it is January. All right, so next, we did some publications this year. We did not have a legal intern this year, so we didn't have a lot of legal publications, but we did have an intern from ASU, Honors College. He wrote an article about the new HHS ruling regarding the LGBT community and their rights. He also wrote about the superintendent of education, who I'm sure you all know, Mr. Horn, who approved PragerU curriculum for use in Arizona schools. Now, PragerU is not a university. PragerU is a joke. It is a bunch of TikTok videos that are completely false and have no educational value whatsoever, and he approved that as curriculum for Arizona schools. And then we have the state bar materials, of course, which you can't get to unless you paid to go. We also got an article on the May abortion decision. Remember when the Supreme Court was debating between Ducey's 15-week ban and the 1864 law, and then that Arizona Supreme Court case came out? We did get an article in the paper about that. Next. And we did some community organizing, I would say more than in the past. And that is that some local groups down in Ajo were trying to stop the state from putting crosses all over on the state highways. They wanted to know how to do that, so I assisted them with that. A candidate actually contacted us and asked about some information to put in his materials, which I thought was a great thing. We also assisted a group in Oro Valley that's fighting the expansion of a church. And I also have this on the list of cases, but I want to talk about it for a minute, which is I filed an objection with the Supreme Court about two judges, Bill Montgomery and Kathleen King from the Arizona Supreme Court, who went to the Red Mass, which is a total Catholic thing, in their robes, and she read scripture and he gave a prayer. Absolutely illegal, unethical to do. Other judges filed a complaint against them. The ethics committee came out and said, wrong, wrong, and wrong. So the Supreme Court dismissed the ethics committee decision. Published it, so it doesn't exist. Unbelievable, just unbelievable. So when that happens, what that leaves, since I can't go through the ethics committee, is straight to the court, so I did. So I filed a complaint straight to the court. I haven't heard back yet. It was the end of October, so it's 3 months, the end of January. I thought, well, I'll give them till the end of January and then see what they're gonna say about it. But I can pretty much guess what they're gonna say about it. Okay, next. And in our infrastructure, I mentioned we didn't have a legal intern. We do have one now. He'll be starting next week, and he's gonna be great. Unfortunately, our legal committee has no members at this time. I keep hoping, as I said, that the bars associations will bring me members, but it hasn't. And I have had a lot of retired people, and they've either quit because of health problems, or they've gone on to other things, or they've become busy in something else that they're doing. So at this particular moment, I don't have anybody. So if there's any attorneys out there, and if you know any attorneys out there, everybody knows an attorney, right? Tell them to get a hold of me and let's get busy. And the last thing I want to talk about is we need a budget for a legal department. Any questions on my legal report? Because I'm going to skew off on something else here. Yeah. Well, the individual people were putting the crosses out. You know how they do when somebody dies here or there or whatever? And they were putting them on state highways. So he wanted to know if that was legal, which it isn't. You have to get permission. And then they can only stay for a certain period of time, and they have to be in a certain way and all of this sort of thing. So I had to find all that out for him and who to complain to and what to do about it and all of that sort of thing. Okay? Any other questions? All right. Today is my birthday. I tried to talk him out of having it today, but no. So today I am 78. I came on this board in 2016 and started to run the legal department ever since. My usual rule is I will stay somewhere 5 years, and then it's time to move off and let new blood come in and, change and this and that and the other. So I have long overstayed my stay, and that'll be 10 years. And I just agreed that I would finish out this, we had new board elections in August, and so it's a 2-year term, so it'll be August of 2026. At that time, I will be 4 months from being 80. Yeah, exactly. I'm still gonna be kicking butt, but I wanna be done with being responsible for everything and being reportable for everything. So anyway, I wanna hire some young whippersnapper who I can train how to do some legal butt kicking, right? Because you don't learn this in law school, let me tell you. You don't learn this in law school. All right, so we really have to get a paid attorney and a legal department going because that's very important. Education is wonderful, yes, we need that. Outreach, organization, yes, organization is very important. You also need the hammer. If you don't have the hammer, they ignore you, like the schools, like the churches. You need the hammer. So you need your legal department. So what do we need for that? You. We need you. So anything you can donate, $7.80. $78 in honor of my 78th birthday. $780. $7,800 or $78,000, whatever it is, we will take it. So help me celebrate my 78th birthday by making some kind of a donation today, and we'll put it in the legal fund, and we will get some butt-kicking whippersnapper to take my place.
Okay, I can see somebody is trying to get to the right slide because right now we are going to be welcoming a virtual guest. Okay, if go past David. So we maybe got those. Okay, go to the next one, right? Am I right about this? Because it's Matthew Taylor next, correct? Somebody help me here? Matthew Taylor's next. Okay, thank you. All right, so. And he's here, right?
Actually, Jeannie, he has not yet logged in, so we might want to wait a minute and maybe show the QR code donation slide, which is the very last one in the whole slideshow.
Okay. Hopefully it's not a time zone thing. Sometimes that will. I don't remember which one of these. Does it say on your script that the panel is next? Huh, on my script it's different. Well, let me check real quick. I apologize, everybody. Summit, there we go. Oh, okay. 10:30 to 11. I don't know how I messed that up. I apologize, folks. Let me find my spot. I have been fighting a cold, so I'm just got a little bit of brain fog going on, so I apologize for that. All right, let's go ahead then, and I will move to the right place here. So today we're going to be, is David here? Is David here? David Felton's not here. Okay. All right then. So today I am going to be speaking with the pastor of this church, Pastor Ken Heinzleman. He's the pastor here at Shadow Rock United Church of Christ. He has been the pastor at this progressive fellowship for almost 17 years. His wife Peg has been his life partner for 46 years, and they have 3 children and 4 grandchildren. Their ministry has been characterized as a journey of growth into greater inclusion, justice, and intimacy with the spirit of life and love. So please, let's welcome our host, Pastor Ken. All righty.
Hey, good morning, everyone, and welcome.
So, Pastor Ken, can you maybe just talk a little bit about what you've been experiencing in the last, say, I don't know, 8 years with regards to your church, the membership, the diversity of your congregation, the enrollment of your congregation? That's a lot of questions.
It is a lot of questions. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Uh, I have seen, really, I've been in the ministry for 40 years, and I have seen this rise of syncretism between church and state, especially evangelical churches, more fundamentalist churches. I've seen it creep into the pews, into the theology, into the mindset of people that are in the pews. They very much want to wrap the Bible with the flag and have this mythology that the country is like God's chosen people, the new chosen people, and they have this destiny that they're trying to fulfill. They have this historical mandate, and they very much want that reflected then in what they experience in local congregations. I think that why we've seen a rise in that, at least a rise in the rhetoric around that, and those are very loud and obnoxious voices that we have seen in our media, and they have grown louder and more obnoxious. I'm not convinced that everyone that sits in the pews and hears that really believe it, but neither are they figuring out how to take a stand in that, against that, and that when they don't believe it, they're getting up and they're leaving. And so then they're becoming unchurched or de-churched because they think that's the only kind of church that there is. So we've seen that, and we're very clear here at Shadow Rock, and I think David at David's church, at progressive churches, very much make a distinction between ourselves, the values that we have, very much value the Constitution, value separation of church and state, and really believe that our faith has this kind of prophetic role. That is, our job is to be conscience of society and not to rubber stamp approve what the establishment or what the government is doing. And so we're very, very different orientations to government.
So do you feel like you need to have more programming here that goes beyond your Sunday sermons? Like, do you try to make this space like a community gathering space to kind of drive that home?
Yeah, very, very much so. I think why sometimes it may feel like we're spitting in the wind. It's not the term that came to my mind, but it's close. In that, I think it's important that we continue to be faithful and offer an alternative narrative. I think that's important for us to do. And what that looks like in terms of programming then is we're happy to be a polling site. We're glad that people come here to vote. We want democracy to work. We're very happy to be a place for legislative districts to meet, for desert progressives to meet, because we share in these values. But I think there's some other ways that to really to get more at the heart of the challenge, especially in our schools, is that we had for many years, we have, since COVID we haven't, but we want to start it back up, is to offer a program called OWL, O-W-L. It stands for Our Whole Lives. And it's a comprehensive human sexuality curriculum based on inclusion, which is very much the opposite of either no sex education in our schools or abstinence only education in schools. That doesn't work. And it came to me that this is a life and death issue, especially for our young people, because, for example, several years ago, I was asked to be a clergy person at Eisenhower High School, where there was a murder-suicide between two young women. And we very much, I saw the need the need for a comprehensive sexual education that was inclusive and based on values, and that it was very much a life and death issue. So we could offer that here in contrast to what's being done or not being done in our schools. I think that we could offer Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. We need to offer alternative histories, economics, politics, civics, on down the line, because Christian nationalism is terrible, terrible theology, terrible education. It is terrible policy. It's terrible history. I don't even like using those terms in relationship to what the content is that they do. So we can offer those programs and continue to do so.
So you've already started to implement like Our Whole Lives curriculum with your youth program?
We need to start it up again. Since COVID, we haven't done it. And so we are rebuilding since COVID, and that's on our list to do. We did it, we offered it for about 10 years before COVID.
I came from a school district. When I was on the governing board, we actually were able to implement Our Whole Lives, and there's another part of that too, but it still complies with the abstinence only piece of Arizona policy or statute, but you can still teach it, and the numbers from that, because that was back in 2014, so we have 10 years of data to show that those kids are far less likely to have an unexpected pregnancy, to have an STI. They're much more likely to get out of an unhealthy relationship. I mean, you name it, and all of the metrics are positive when the kids just have the truth in front of them.
Absolutely, and part of it being comprehensive also is that it does not run away from LGBT persons. It runs toward them.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that was one of the things Kathy's former superintendent, Kathy Hoffman, was able to remove this is what they called it, no promo homo, like you weren't even allowed to acknowledge our LGBTQ students or anybody for that matter. So, and that just shows too, having actual educators in that position instead of a lawyer who I think had like a hit and run accident several years ago and is using our tax dollars to promote the voucher system that's going to bankrupt our state. Like those elections really, really matter. So, yeah. So have you been able to scoop up maybe any of these like refugees from these more, Christian nationalist churches?
Yeah, that's a great question. Theological refugees.
Yeah.
I don't know how they would characterize themselves. I think that in our culture, there's this cliche where people will say, "I'm spiritual but not religious," and I get that. I get that the religious institutions have not been representing love, faith, hope, the best of what it means to be human. I get that. Therefore, because we are a church, we are often automatically put into that, to quote Hillary Clinton, basket of deplorables. We're automatically put in there. However, we have been able from time to time, and I think it's mostly by relationship, get refugees, as you put it. We are definitely, I think, progressive churches, and this is not about Shadow Rock. We're just one of many. That progressive churches, we very much are for people who want to be honest about the complexity of the way life is, all of its horrors, all of its beauties. It's deep sense of the gift of life, to trust that giftedness, to be intimate with mystery, because we call it God, but we don't really know what that is. And that is very much in contrast to churches that say, we know exactly what God is, we know exactly what life is about. If you believe the right thing the right way at the right time, then you're going to go to heaven. I don't even know that there's a heaven. I'm pretty damn sure there's not a hell. But that's a journey. That's a spiritual journey and we need companions for that. And this is the kind of place that's what progressive churches, that's what they do well, I think.
I remember when I was speaking with a Unitarian Universalist church, I think up in Prescott, they were the first ones, and this is probably like 3 years ago, they were the first ones to point out, like, sure, we don't really want those mega churches to be tax exempt, but also remember us, because we will absolutely go the way of the dinosaur if we're expected to no longer, or, to lose our tax exempt status.
Yeah, I think that's a discussion that we should have, and we should not, and religious leaders should not be afraid to have. I think that we have seen the abuse of that status by enough religious leadership that it deserves a discussion. And those of us who would definitely be hurt by that change, let's not be afraid of that discussion. Let's have it. Let's figure it out. And is the abuse that it would stop worth the cost of what it would do for progressive churches? I don't know the answer to that question, but I think you got to talk about it instead of avoid it.
So have you ever been fearful of attacks from people? We talked earlier about like whether we wanted to have security here or not, and I know that you also, along with a lot of other pastors and rabbis throughout the county and maybe even throughout the state, you stepped up to help when refugees were coming in across our southern border. Were you ever under attack at that point, or have you been?
No, the closest thing we had to an attack was a neighbor down the street who very, very conservative and doesn't want anything like this in her backyard, kind of NIMBYism kind of thing. We have had people who were concerned, and out of those concerns, we have from time to time hired security to be present because we know that we are a potential target. We have we get reports of people who kind of go around and show up at progressive churches and be disruptive. Those kinds of things, they have not landed here. We're grateful for that. We have had some protests, but we've never been afraid. And we also have a preschool here with about 100 children. And from time to time, we get concerns from parents that if we're too public, what are we, is that going to call attention in a negative way, put their children at risk? So we have had those conversations, but we continue to move forward. At the time, at the height of that discussion, we probably were given hospitality to about 100 refugees here. They were here for 3 to 4 days, and excuse me, they were in a detention center for anywhere from 30 to 90 days before they were released. They were put on a bus from immigration enforcement and then brought here for hospitality for 3 to 4 days. And so they would wash their clothes. They have underwear in the bushes drying, and preschool families would walk up and, what's that? And it's like, well, then it opened up the discussion about immigration with children and a discussion about what it means to give hospitality to the least of these. So we take those opportunities, we use those events as opportunities.
And, you brought up this idea of fear, and I don't know about all of you, but after the election, I was not okay, I immediately went to like fear and dread and hopelessness. And I'm still, there's so much uncertainty in our future. I really don't know what 2025 and beyond is going to look like, but I've managed somehow, and I think it's through community and fellowship like this, to be able to just know that there are so many people out there who are probably feeling as afraid and uncertain as I am. So let's close with that. Like, how do you help your congregation to get through the fear and uncertainty of what our future in this country holds?
I think that the first thing is to admit it, to own it. And if that means talking with other people, writing it down, making it part of a daily practice, even a spiritual practice of meditation, I think that's one thing. I think the second thing is like you said, is to be a part of a community, be part of a group that share your values, and then you know you're not alone. And then the third thing is to understand that there is a spiritual truth, that the opposite of fear is not necessarily courage, but courage is doing the right thing even in the face of fear. So it's not the elimination of fear, but that the way to diminish fear really is love. And you experience love most profoundly in those quiet times and in time of fellowship with each other, and when you hold a hope for the future, knowing that life is better, can be better than what we're doing right now. That society can be more just, can be more peaceful, can be more inclusive, and holding on to that hope and living out that hope. Then when you're so busy living out that hope, you don't have time for fear. So
that is a really good point, and I think it gives all of us to like maybe a vision for 2025 too, to you know, not just roll over and let the fascists win, but to roll up our sleeves and join in and find fellowship and commonality with everybody.
And I want to say thank you to you for your vision, and that your vision for secular Arizona to include us as partners in this, because we do share these values, we do share this vision. And we don't need to get tied up in any kind of theological content BS, that it's our values and our vision that hold us together. And I thank you for your vision.
Thanks.
Okay.
All right. So I'm going to go back over here. Thank you so much. Oh, wait, we got a question? Sorry. Yeah, I built in some time for questions. Yes, sir.
I was wondering to what extent you exchange our dialogue with ministers from other more conservative congregations. To what extent you discuss these things, and to what extent do you get into what you really think Jesus' vision is of what we should be doing? How you reconcile that with within those discussions?
Yeah, I want to thank you for the question, first of all. Second of all, I'm not in that discussion with that many people from other churches. I will say, I want to be completely honest about it and say that I often find leaders in those churches, other pastors, I have experienced them to be kind. I've experienced them to be helpful partners in so far as extending charity to people who are in need. If we keep the discussion in those areas, we're good. If we begin to go outside of that shared charitable work into theology, into how you read the Bible, into what the implications of that for marginalized people, then we would begin to get into perhaps some disagreements that would keep us from partnering on that important charitable work. But we have enough grace to mostly avoid that. That a lot of people who are speaking so obnoxiously from the pulpit as a public speaker, as a public proclamation, they're not always that obnoxious in person. Okay? That's been my experience. Okay.
Yeah, Diane.
I'm also on the Arizona Commission on African American Affairs, and we're looking for places to have the classes on racial history, which is also trying to be erased in our education. Would you be interested in talking to the commission about that?
Yes.
So real quick, the question was from Dianne Post about, because somebody reminded me that we can't hear. No, but we've got people online. So asking if perhaps there could be a partnership with the, what did you call it? The
Arizona Commission on African American Affairs.
Arizona Commission for African American Affairs. So yeah, there's room for partnerships, it sounds like. And when you talked about the curriculum too, we have one member, volunteer, who's very passionate about curriculum. So perhaps it would be an opportunity for us to really dig in, maybe do a religions of the world, maybe do comprehensive sex ed or a civics class, like, you know, critical thinking classes, digital literacy, you know, there's lots of opportunities. It was interesting to me last year when Representative Juan Mendez, or no, he was senator last year, he put forth a digital literacy bill that would, I mean, the language in the bill was incredible. It was like, we're gonna protect our kids, we're gonna show them critical thinking skills, we're gonna show them what a reliable source, you know, primary source, all that stuff. Nope, they didn't want it. They don't want our kids to be digitally literate or literate in any other way. So it may be up to us to find back channels, especially as they continue to limit the curriculum that teachers can teach or the ways that they can teach. Go ahead, close us out.
I was just going to say that decentering whiteness, dealing with white fragility, a comprehensive view of history, all of those things, we're very open to that and would love to see us be a center where that is happening. Again, offering that alternative narrative to the limited narrative that is out there.
All right. Oh, one last one. Go ahead.
I'd like your opinion, especially from Pastor Ken there. It seems that for decades now, I've been complaining about the fact that progressives, frankly, just aren't mean enough not that serious, aren't mean enough to combat the conservatives that are literally willing to murder people to get what they want. For instance, Jeanne said something nice about, she tactfully said something about Tom Moore, and he was a hypocrite, and now he's Secretary of Education. I think that for elections, for Tom Moore, people like him have a chance, that the progressives need to get meaner and say things like, Tom Moore was snaking around, having an affair with his mistress when he had that car accident. And he's trying to destroy public education. Jeanne's a great person, I love her, however, she's just too nice to express things in a way that people appreciate. Most people in America, frankly, are such powerful parts of the windstorm that unless they hear something very, very concrete one way or another, it just doesn't phase. So I have your opinion on that.
So the comment, I guess, is that progressives are too nice and we need to take the gloves off more. Yeah. Okay. Thoughts on that, Pastor Ken?
Well, I have to agree. I have found you to be very nice. You might want to work on that. But I think that I think there's kind of a culture in progressive churches that they want to be nice people. They want to be the reasonable ones. They want to be the adults in the room. But also coupled with that is this notion of absolute relativism. That is, part of the way I show myself as being progressive would be that everybody's opinion counts and everyone is entitled to their opinion. Every opinion is valued. And I think what progressives need to do is say, no, that's bullshit. Because there are some opinions that are actually more valuable than others. There are some opinions that are more informed than others. Therefore, they don't have the same value. And also, there are some opinions that have a foundation of being life-giving instead of life-thwarting, that are loving instead of hateful, that are more just instead of unjust, that are inclusive instead of exclusive, and that we can in fact weigh and evaluate and make a judgment about that and stand for that. So that's part of that critical thinking that is not encouraged in our churches, and it's not always encouraged in progressive churches. Progressive pastors have often been taught how to do that, but they're not teaching people in the pews how to do that. And therefore, we're not equipping people in the pews to articulate that vision and to articulate those stands and those values. Thank you. Okay.
All right. If anybody wants to stretch, maybe, go to the bathroom real quick. I'm gonna transition over here and introduce our next guest, who is here because I got the schedule wrong. So give me a second. Okay, so I'm going to take a moment here to introduce our next guest. It has been just over a year since we spoke with our next guest, where he spoke about the new apostolic reformation. And he's come back via Zoom to speak with us again today. Matthew D. Taylor is a religious studies scholar and expert in independent charismatic Christianity and Christian nationalism. He is also the creator, writer, and narrator of the Charismatic Revival Fury audio documentary series on the Straight White American Jesus podcast. And if you haven't listened to the Straight White American Jesus podcast, seriously, what are you even doing with your lives? You should all download it right now, subscribe to it. It is very good, and he does some really great deep dives about Christianity and specifically evangelical Christianity. So let's go ahead and welcome Matthew Taylor, everybody. And do we want him to be full screen, y'all? Okay, then let's go ahead and do that. And then I'm just gonna take this so when we have questions, I'll be able to run around like Phil Donahue. Okay.
And just to be clear, I have 30 minutes. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great.
Yes.
All right, let me share my screen because I do have a slideshow here for us. And I guess it's morning where you are, afternoon where I am. So good morning to you. Thank you for having me with you today. And I'm just grateful for the invitation and grateful that gatherings like this can take place. I think it's very productive to get together and think together. So as I'm presenting, I want to talk a little bit about my book, but I also just want to think about the moment that we are in. And I'd like to offer 3 theses for the moment that we're in, for the election that we just came through, and for what we can do going forward. So I'm going to run through these really quickly, and I'll go through them in much more depth as I go along. The first is that MAGA is a populist authoritarian movement wedded to a religious nationalist movement. And it's important that we get our categories straight about what we're dealing with and what is going on in our country right now. The second thesis is that the Christian theologies and Christian supremacist identities that have come to the fore in the Trump MAGA era are a kind of threat the US has not seen before. We're dealing with something new. And then the third thesis is that if we are going to resist and or defeat MAGA, which I think we need the biggest possible secular and religious coalition available. So let me go through those in a little bit more depth, and I want to talk about January 6th along the way, because I think it's a very important piece of what is going on right now. So first, again, that first thesis, MAGA is a populist authoritarian movement wedded to a religious nationalist movement. And by populist authoritarian movement, we are talking about movements that are in many ways the Achilles heel of democracies, of liberal democracies. Populist authoritarian movements use these kind of primal tribal fears and promises of empowering their own tribe to bring an authoritarian government to power via democratic elections. And this is the real challenge. This is what the founding fathers called the demagogue, right? This is a movement that utilizes the emotions and the fears that people carry, gets them into this kind of tribal polarized space, comes to power and then institutes their own authoritarian agenda. And we've seen this around the world. There are many, many of these populist authoritarian movements. This is a surging phenomenon around the world. We see this in Viktor Orban's Hungary. We see this in Recep Tayyip Erdogan's Turkey. We see this in Narendra Modi's India. So this is not unique to the United States, but this is what we are dealing with in the United States now. So when we talk about a religious nationalist movement, though, I think it's important that we, again, define our terms. And so what are we talking about when we're talking about American Christian nationalism? So as I said, this is part of a species that we could call religious nationalism, right? The idea that you can conflate your national identity, your political clan, your sense of patriotism with your religion, that those layers merge very neatly. That is the idea of religious nationalism. I think it is well captured in these flags that we saw everywhere on January 6th, that Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president, as though those two thoughts were somehow inseparable for some people. Right. And right now we're in a moment where globally religious nationalism is on the rise. As I was saying, that you can see instances of this in Turkey. You can see Jewish nationalism on the rise, what we would call religious Zionism in Israel. You can see Buddhist nationalism in Myanmar and Sri Lanka, Christian nationalism in Russia and Hungary and Brazil, Hindu nationalism in India. This is a global phenomenon, and the U.S. is very much following a global trend in this at the moment. I think we should be very much in conversation with what is going on around the world. This is not a sui generis American exceptionalism kind of situation that we're in. We are part of a global culture and a global moment, and I think we need to attend to that. Now, when we talk about this in the U.S., this is seen in this assertion that the U.S. is a Christian nation, so that America, in one definition, America has a special ordained covenantal relationship with God. Or another version of this is that Christians and or Christianity should be privileged over other religious and non-religious identities in government policy and the public square. The first definition is a little bit more philosophical, a little more theological, a little more about the kind of identity of the United States. The second one is much more about policy. And these often go together, but they can be teased out. And so I think we need to always be clear who we're talking about and what form of Christian nationalism we're talking about. And I think it's also, we need to attend to some of the shifts that have gone on in our culture really within the last 4 decades or so that have brought about this. And so I want to offer two statements, one of which should probably be uncontroversial to everyone in the room. The second of which is actually very controversial in our society right now, but I think they're both actually very true. So the first is the decline of white dominance in the United States has produced a white nationalist and white supremacist backlash. Hopefully that's not controversial to anyone in the room, right? And so you have the chart here showing the census data, and as you can see, in 1990, more than 3/4 of the U.S. population identified as white, and by 2020 that was down under 58%. Right. So, and of course, in August of 2017, we witnessed some of the backlash of that in this Unite the Right rally that occurred in Charlottesville, where you had white nationalists and white supremacist protesters marching in the streets. And what are they chanting? You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. Right. And anti-Semitism is always this kind of ground layer. As conspiracy theories and paranoia emerge, anti-Semitism is always there. It's always going to come out in those moments. Now, here's the more controversial statement. The decline of Christian dominance in the United States has produced a Christian nationalist and Christian supremacist backlash. So here again, we see a chart showing from in 1990, up until 1990, in all the survey data that we have, 90% or more of Americans identified as Christian. Right? So to say the United States is a Christian nation in 1970 means something very different than it means today when somebody asserts that. Down now today in 2020 and 2022, they're measuring this at around 64, 63% of Americans are identifying as Christian. So in the course of about 35 years, roughly a third of the people who were identifying as Christian, or at least the percentage of the population that was identifying as Christian, has melted away. And we are a more secular nation today than we were even a few decades ago. Now, these two things go together. Right? But not all perfectly. It's not always white Christians. In fact, part of what we saw in this most recent election is that Christians of color we're migrating towards Donald Trump. And I think we need to attend to that. Now, when we talk about Christian nationalism, I think we need to both attend to the international situation. We also need to recognize that Christian nationalism is a spectrum, and not all forms of Christian nationalism are as much of a threat as others. So I think we need to think about this spectrum and pay attention to, again, who are we engaging with? What are the forms of Christian nationalism that we are encountering in the real world? And I would argue that the spectrum runs from what we could call soft Christian nationalism, and there's other terms for this that have been used in the different surveys and books that have been written. This is my terminology, but this is a more kind of passive, more democratic, more sentimental style of Christian nationalism. And I see this it's symbolized in, and this is very common in many churches, having an American flag alongside a Christian flag at the church altar. Right? That's not, in churches I grew up going to, that was a common practice. It's not my cup of tea. I would prefer not to have a national symbol in my church, but it's also not a huge threat to American democracy. I sometimes also call these soft Christian nationalists the God bless America kind of Christian nationalists, right? It's a nostalgic kind of sentimental thing. They like the idea of a simpler, more Christian country. Now, at the other end of the spectrum are very dangerous forms of Christian nationalism, what we would call hardline Christian nationalisms, also known as Christian supremacy. And this is more organized, more anti-democratic, and more theological. Ironically, the more theology people introduce into their Christian nationalism, the more hardline it becomes, because it becomes built into their belief system. If it's just nostalgia, if it's just kind of a vague sense of godly patriotism, then it's not going to interfere as much with their religious identity. The more theological it becomes, the more dangerous, I would argue, that Christian nationalism becomes. And when we talk about radicalization in the United States Christian population, it's about people moving along this spectrum, people moving from these more passive, sentimental forms of Christian nationalism into more hardline forms of Christian nationalism and Christian supremacy. And right now, the situation that we are in, and this is very much the context in which the 2024 election occurred, the lost cause narrative that Donald Trump and his allies advanced about the 2020 election, the idea that the 2020 election was stolen from them, has spurred along many conspiracy theories, has radicalized many Christian nationalists, and is encouraging more and more of this violent and anti-democratic rhetoric and organizing. Here's a crazy statistic. Coming into the 2024 election, 1/3 of the US population believed that the 2020 election was stolen. 1/3. And if you looked among white evangelicals, it was closer to 2/3. So we're talking about a set of beliefs in conspiracy theories that are distorting reality for 1/3 of the population coming into this election. And then what we witnessed 4 years ago on January 6th was a coalition of these white nationalists and white supremacists and Christian nationalists and Christian supremacists making an anti-democratic power grab to reinstall their avatar, Donald Trump, as an illegitimate president. That was what January 6th was about. You can get into all the details about, oh, there were fights over the Electoral College and the counting of the electoral votes and all the technicalities of that and Dominion voting and what specific conspiracies. But in the big picture, that is what was going on 4 years ago on January 6th. And what we just witnessed a few months ago was they didn't need an insurrection to do it. They were able to do it through an election. And that is the danger of these populist authoritarian movements. So, our second thesis, Christian theologies and Christian supremacist identities that have come to the fore in the Trump MAGA era are a kind of threat the US has not seen before. I want to dig into this a little bit because I think this is really where the argument of my book in many ways. The ascendant style of American Christian nationalism is what we would call independent and charismatic. And let me define both those terms. So charismatic here, we're not using this in the kind of generic sense of somebody who has a magnetic and attractive personality. Here we're using it in the technical Christian sense. And this comes from the Greek. It's a term that is used in the Christian New Testament. And the idea of the charismata, or the gifts or the graces of God, these are special endowments through the Holy Spirit that are given to the church for the service of the church. And so to be charismatic today is to be a Christian who is invested in accessing these more supernatural dimensions of early Christianity This includes things like speaking in tongues, belief in miracles and modern miracles and performing miracles, belief in modern day prophecy. And then when we talk about independent, that's a synonym for non-denominational, as in not attached to the bureaucracy and accountability and governance of denominational bodies. Now, how do you know if you are encountering an independent charismatic person or an independent charismatic church? Well, there's some markers of this, and you actually have quite a few of these in Arizona, and I know I've spoken with some of you before about some of the specific independent charismatic churches that are operating in your particular region. But this independent charismatic part of the church is the fastest growing segment in American Christianity and the fastest growing segment in global Christianity. So this is a growth edge in the church. This is a very rapidly growing part of the church, both in the US and globally. It's also ethnically diverse and globally connected. This is not just a US phenomenon. This is something that is happening all around the world and is highly networked around the world. And so leaders from the US in these movements are also traveling around the world, and leaders from around the world are coming to the US, and there's theological ideas that are crossing borders and crossing boundaries. So this is not merely an issue of, oh, this is an American problem, this is an American situation. This is something that's happening globally. In fact, 2 years ago, there were the Capitol riots that occurred in Brasilia, in Brazil, over the ouster of Jair Bolsonaro. Many of the same networks of Christian leaders that were involved in the US Capitol riot were also involved in organizing and mobilizing for the Brasilia Capitol riots. So this is not merely a thing that is happening in the US. There are transnational networks of Christian supremacy that have their targets set on the United States right now. One of the things that is very common in this independent charismatic space is a belief in what they would call modern prophecy, that there are prophets living amongst us right now who speak the words of God. This is unusual in the history of the church. This is a fairly new belief that people are adopting, that there are modern day prophets. And they also will engage in these ecstatic spiritual practices, like being slain in the spirit, having an almost fainting fit, a spiritual fainting fit, fainting fit. And there's also an emphasis in this world on what they call spiritual warfare, the idea that there are angels and demons battling around us all the time, and that Christians can participate in this invisible cosmic warfare through prayer practices, through blowing shofars, through participating in worship services, right? So this is a very militant conception of the life of the church and of the role of the church in society. And as I said, because they're independent, they are not tied into any of these denominational accountability structures, but they are highly networked, especially at the leadership level. There's this global leadership and celebrity class of charismatic celebrities who operate in charismatic media, who are very, very relationally interconnected. And you can't actually understand this world without recognizing the relationships among these leaders and how those function. And I sometimes refer to this whole sector of American Christianity as the Silicon Valley of the American church. It's ecstatic, it's experiential, and it's very technologically savvy, very good at breaking into new technological spaces, very active on social media, very active on YouTube. They have podcasts. I mean, there's a whole media culture that exists around this kind of independent charismatic space that actually is one of the main vectors for carrying these conspiracy theories. It's not just Fox News, it's not just OANN, it's especially these Christian networks that are carrying some of these conspiracy theories, and that's why we see higher levels of belief in lies about the 2020 election among Christians than among other groups. So in my book, I argue that at the heart of January 6th, there was a band of these independent charismatic thought leaders centered around this man, C. Peter Wagner. And even though Peter Wagner died in 2016, I argue that he and the people that he mentored had a very significant impact on January 6th. And Peter Wagner was a Fuller Seminary professor. I myself am an alumni of Fuller Seminary, fairly mainstream evangelical seminary. But towards the end of his life, Peter Wagner went in many ways around the bend, and he became fixated with these charismatic leaders and with these independent charismatic spaces, and he began to pioneer new modes of spiritual warfare in the 1990s that he called strategic spiritual warfare. that he argued was you were able to battle back demonic hierarchies. There were high-level, high-ranking demons that had control over literal physical territory, and if you could just mobilize enough Christians praying and doing spiritual warfare at the same time, you could cast out these high-level demons. And he also came to believe in the 1990s in the idea of a modern-day apostles and modern-day prophets who would lead the church into a global revival and establish Christian dominion over societies. And he pulled together a bunch of these leaders and a bunch of these ideas, and he branded that as the New Apostolic Reformation. This was the phrase that he kind of glommed onto as the marker of his movement. He started building out these leadership networks of these people who were claiming to be apostles and prophets. Many of them were also pastors of local churches, but they were adopting these identities of we are modern day apostles, we are modern day prophets. And at the peak of the New Apostolic Reformation movement, there were hundreds, maybe even in the low thousands of leaders who were participating in Wagner's networks, who were identifying with this movement. And those leaders, those networks of leaders became the backbone of Christian Trumpism as Donald Trump entered American politics. And so, I tell the whole backstory of this in my book, but the long and short of it is that the New Apostolic Reformation and these other independent charismatic leaders were some of the first and most ardent Christians to support Donald Trump in the 2016 election. A very important figure here is a guy named Lance Wallnau, who was a friend and an acolyte, a mentee of Peter Wagner's. Also very central in this dynamic is Paula White-Cain, who is Trump's closest spiritual advisor and the chair of his Evangelical Advisory Board, currently called the National Faith Advisory Board. And Paula White-Cain really was the linchpin who opened the doors of the Trump campaign to these independent charismatic leaders, got them in at the ground level, and then really brought them into the center of power. And at least a dozen of Trump's evangelical advisors were or are apostles and prophets affiliated with the networks that Wagner started, and many more were independent charismatic megachurch pastors. Some of these were formal advisors. Sometimes it was more informal. And so sometimes you can look at the lists. You also have to watch the pictures and who's showing up, who's around Trump, who's having meetings with him. There's actually a fairly wide circle of people of religious leaders who surround Donald Trump, who propagandize him, and who vouch for him to their communities and to the broader Christian community. Now, as I said, one of the markers of this independent charismatic belief is the belief in modern day prophecy. And so part of what happens starting in 2015, almost as soon as Donald Trump enters the race, there begins to be prophecies issued by these charismatic prophets about Donald Trump, saying that he's a figure of special destiny, that he is God's chosen person to lead the country, that he is the one who is destined to become president. And when Donald Trump wins the 2016 election, this only accelerates this process of these prophecies around Donald Trump. And by the time of the 2020 election, hundreds of these charismatic prophets claimed that they had divine revelation, that to each of them individually, that God was going to anoint Donald Trump for a second term in office, that God had chosen Donald Trump for a second term in office. And so once Donald Trump refused to accept the results of the 2020 election, all these prophets start saying in chorus, God needs to intervene. We need to do spiritual warfare to fulfill these prophecies. And this became the spirituality of January 6th, building towards spiritual warfare campaigns to fulfill these prophecies about Donald Trump. And the leaders from the New Apostolic Reformation were central to organizing and orchestrating these campaigns of spiritual warfare, guided around trying to get Donald Trump reinstated. They were supplying, in many ways, the spiritual complement to the Stop the Steal rally. And that's why you have a number of these New Apostolic Reformation leaders, and I describe many of the key ones in my book, who then show up on January 6th. They both create the ideas, the theological ideas that undergird January 6th, and then they show up themselves and are leading the people in the crowd. Now, I'd love to get into this, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes for questions if you have questions. But check out my book, or if you can't afford the $30 or whatever for the book, go and listen to the podcast. But I want to highlight what is unique about this moment in American Christian supremacist organizing and power. And just 3 points here. First, Christian supremacists have access to the White House and sway over their president and party like they've never had before. Donald Trump is more responsive these leaders than George W. Bush or George H.W. Bush or Ronald Reagan ever were. He sees them as his core constituency. He gives them a great deal of access to himself, and especially through people like Paula White Cain, they have a lot of sway in the White House and in the agenda setting. And that's new. A lot of times the Republican presidents in the past played along with these folks, welcomed their support, but then Heisman trophied them when the time came to actually make policy. That's not the case, especially not in the second Trump administration. Second, these Christian supremacists have a highly networked and grassroots infrastructure, which has, as far as I can tell, there's no parallel to this on the left. There is no deep bench of grassroots networks that are all linked together, that are all coordinating, that are all spreading messages, that are all mobilizing and getting out the vote. And part of the genius of the 2024 Trump campaign was deploying these networks of Christian leaders and Christian mobilization as their grassroots mobilization. It was a very, very effective get out the vote strategy, and it worked quite well. And lastly, these Christian supremacists have endowed Trump and MAGA with this prophecy-driven national revival sense of destiny. There's a great deal of optimism in these circles that they are going to accomplish their agenda. And so I think we need to be attentive that this is not merely like, oh, humdrum, they're kind of business as usual. They see this as a moment to push really hard, because they recognize that they have a window of opportunity in the second Trump administration to get through a lot of things they've been wanting for decades. And so lastly, and here's the last thesis, is if we are going to resist and or defeat MAGA, we need the biggest possible secular and religious coalition that we can muster. Let me offer just a quick reflection on how I think Americans are divided right now, and I'll end with this, and hopefully again we have a couple minutes for questions. I think we exist as a society right now in three bubbles that are roughly a third of the country each. The first third of the country that I've already mentioned is the MAGA bundle. And this is, they live in this propaganda bubble where they believe in these conspiracy theories. This is mostly rural and ex-urban, some suburban. I live in a suburban neighborhood. There's Trump banners all over my neighborhood. They're predominantly Christian. They're predominantly white, but as we saw in this recent election, it was not only white people that gravitated towards Trump. There was a broad spectrum of Christians actually moved to Trump's direction. They buy into these conspiracy theories about the 2020 election. And I would argue that the folks in this MAGA core, not everyone who voted for Trump, but folks in this MAGA core are virtually unreachable and undetachable from Trump. They are committed to this stuff to the point where they believe the lies, right? They buy into the conspiracy theories. You're not going to dislodge that easily for these folks. Now, the bubble at the other end of the spectrum is the one that I'm assuming most of us on this call or in this room are in, and that's what I would call the liberal mainstream media bubble, right? So this is folks who typically are urban and suburban. These are the folks who live in the blue dots. If you see the political maps, these are liberal Christians, people who are secular, people who belong to other religions predominantly. They're college educated and they're financially stable. They live in factual reality, but we also have a narrow cultural consensus. Just to illustrate it, I thought it was incredibly simple to look at this election and say Kamala Harris is the person that should be chosen in this election. She seems perfectly qualified. She seems like a wonderful person. She seems smart. She's got the experience. Why wouldn't anyone choose her over Trump? And yet the country did not, right? So the consensus that obtains within that little liberal bubble, as much as it may be grounded in reality and in commentary and in smart ideas, does not work for everyone. It did not reach the country. And there we come to the third bubble, the bubble in the middle. This is what I would just call the disaffected bubble. People in this are all over the map. Urban, suburban, ex-urban, rural. They're all over the place. Many of them are nominal Christians, right? They're not, these are kind of, I call these people the shruggers when it comes to religion. They're what we might call the nuns oftentimes, the people who say when they're asked what their religious identity is, none of the above. But these are people who religion, as far as I can tell, is not a very big deal to them. But they might have some kind of vestigial attachment to some religious identity. They're very downtrodden. They're very angry with American politics and with American institutions, and they do not consume mainstream media. They have a very chaotic media and information diet. And part of what this election revealed is that the people in the middle, that third in the middle, is far more susceptible to Trump propaganda and MAGA and right-wing messaging than they are to the mainstream media and to our, honestly, reality. Here is the task for the next 4 years. The whole ball game is in who wins the middle. And if I can say anything to a gathering titled the Secular Summit in early January 2025, it is this. Secularists and Christians and Muslims and Jews and Hindus and Buddhists and every other religious or non-religious group that values liberal democracy needs to band together right now. Elections are not going to get any easier from here. Part of the populist authoritarian playbook is you pull up the ladder behind you and you make the elections harder from that point forward, and you enshrine your group in a privileged position in society. Elections are only going to get harder from here. And so we need to build a supermajority coalition to win over as much of that middle as possible. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know what that middle needs or what they want. And I think part of the task of the next 4 years is we have to go out relationally and in every other way, institutionally, and figure out what the people in the middle need and build the biggest possible coalition that we can. And that coalition is going to have to be part secular and part religious. That's just the demographics of it. And so my secular friends, value and welcome your religious friends. Part of the vocabulary we need right now for resistance is theological. And I say the same thing to Christian groups. Value your secular friends. We need our secular friends in this mix. That is the coalition that we need to put together. I'm going to stop talking and hopefully we have a minute for some questions. But again, thank you for having me today.
Thank you so much. All right, there's quite a few questions that I have coming in. If you want to stop sharing your screen, Matthew. Let's see, I've got some questions coming in from our Zoom. So Matthew, first question is, who is funding these fundy Christian networks?
It's a good question. A lot of it's coming from the grassroots, but there are larger donor groups. There was some great reporting that I helped with through ProPublica this last year on a particular donor group called Ziklag, Z-I-K-L-A-G, that's very much tied to these NAR paradigms and some of these NAR leaders. And I think the gateway to get into Ziklag, it's a donor group. I think you had to have like $10 or $25 million net worth just to be part of the group. So there are some very big pocketed or donors and organizations that are behind this. I mean, the Christian right is extremely well networked and extremely well funded in our country. And again, there's no parallel for this on the left. And so we're going to stand up resistance to this. I think there's going to need to be a lot of funding for it. But I also think sometimes the funding can be a red herring because the funding is functional. I think we need to pay attention to the theology and the agenda far more than the funding, because it's not. I don't know that the funding is even accessible to be prevented.
Okay. Next, we have another question coming in from Zoom. Did the rise and success of U.S. Taliban form blue? Okay, did the rise success of U.S. Taliban?
ISIS.
Oh, it's a typo. Okay, thank you.
It's
So
ISIS.
did the rise of ISIS and Taliban form a blueprint for the Christian nationalist movement?
Not consciously. I mean, they would definitely not ever claim that they received any inspiration for ISIS. Here's the reality. Both of these movements are very diffuse. And that's just the nature of things right now. Networks work far better in this diffuse postmodern landscape than hierarchical institutions. And so these kind of resistance or nationalist organizations that organize around networks do a lot better. There's an excellent book called The Rise of Network Christianity, if you want to understand the backdrop for sociologically why these networks are functioning so well. But that's what's going on. That's why you see these resemblances there. It's not that they're taking inspiration from each other. They're both converging on the best possible leadership structure to meet this moment.
Okay, thank you. Another question coming in from Zoom. And by the way, if anybody has any questions, I can come out there Phil Donahue style. Is Charlie Kirk a cog in the new apostolic reformation?
He's very much an ally of the New Apostolic Reformation. He has espoused a lot of their ideology, has adopted their Seven Mountain Mandate framework as organizing structure for Turning Point USA. I wouldn't call him a cog, though. I would say that he's an activist in their vein, and they see him as an ally. They work very closely with him. He's had mentors from the New Apostolic Reformation movement. They would see him as an ally and leader. He's not a tool of theirs. He has agency of his own, but he is very much working in like-minded purposes with them.
Okay. How about live? We have one question. I'm going to walk down so that you can ask Matthew directly.
Thanks for what you've presented. I look at history in America, look at Civil War. We've rewritten that history because we now want to look at it as an economical war, not a slavery war. So that would be the historical shift that the right wing wants to do. The Depression was also anti-Jewish. So there was a lot of movement before World War II for a lot of Christians to rise up against Jews. And you had a lot of mainstream Catholics would be one that bought into that system. So when I look at today's situation, I look at it as an evolution. Which Christianity will win out? So what kind of Christian will emerge in this current stew? You mentioned the Pentecostal type, but really what is it? Because it's a change, it's a softened Jesus approach and more of a Paul maybe approach, because we're looking at 2 Timothy, when we're looking at kowtowing to the empire. So changing of American thinking of Christianity is a American Christian theology and a political theology that's not found in the Bible as much as it's found in the pulpit, because they've changed the thinking. So I don't know. I've presented you some different ideas, but I sit here as an ex-Catholic priest who is involved in a progressive Christian church, which I believe we're under attack. I'm gay. I'm under attack. I'm white. Oh, I'm under attack. But the whole idea is, I think what we've done is, and what we've done so masterfully, we've bypassed the oligarchs that are running things right now, and we've put in Christian oligarchs into this system, and again, it's anti-Jesus, it's anti-biblical teaching, it's anti-prophetic Jew, because there's nothing in the Pentecostal prophetic word that is really speaking to the empire. Didn't they want to cast down the empires who were going to the golden calf? There's a whole bunch of stuff going on.
Yeah, no, great series of questions. I'll just pick a couple of them. So I have no idea which version of Christianity is going to win out. That's a very hard thing to predict. I will say that this is the part of Christianity that's growing right now, right? And so I think those of us who identify as Christians, and I do identify as a Christian, who want to resist this, I think we need to articulate a different theological vision. In fact, my next book that I'm working on is going to be a theology book attempting to refute Christian supremacy and Christian nationalism using the fundamental principles of the Christian tradition and Christian doctrine. And I think more of us need to be doing that. We need to be constructing alternative theologies that resist and challenge this. And that doesn't mean that those theologies are going to win out or become extremely popular. Historically, it's much more popular in Christianity to beat up on people than to be Jesus-like, right? And so, but that doesn't mean that those of us who identify as Christian can then give up on being Jesus-like. It means that we need to push harder. We need to present our theology more compellingly, and we need to make that argument. And those of us who identify as Christians, I think we have a special obligation to resist this, because it's being done in our name. and it is being done in the name of Jesus. And to me, that is verging on heresy at the very least. Thank you.
Thank you. This will have to be our last question. If you want to go ahead and ask the question.
Okay, so my question
Is
is,
it on?
Mike, is it on?
Test.
I can hear you fine.
Okay.
Test.
I can repeat that. Go ahead and what's your question?
So my question is, it's kind of two parts. One is with this professor from Fuller who created kind of this network. Can you name who are some of these groups in this network? And the second part, with all of these folks here in the United States, one of the things that tends to happen is that people who are in leadership roles become a little more competitive and then the infighting starts. Is there infighting going on, or you pointed out how they're standing around Trump? Is there some infighting going on?
Okay, so the question was, who are some of these groups that are involved in this deep network of Christian nationalists? And the second part of your question was, is there infighting within those groups?
Yeah, so in terms of the networks themselves, when we're talking about the independent charismatic world, it really is the leadership culture across the board in the independent charismatic world. And that includes what's called the Word of Faith movement, which is often termed the prosperity gospel, the New Apostolic Reformation, and some of these other apostolic and prophetic networks that I get into in my book. That also includes Messianic Judaism, which is very much an independent charismatic movement. And so those folks really do work well together. I mean, there are internal rivalries, but on the surface, they all are friends and chummy and claim to work together. There are rivalries between different forms of Christian nationalism in the United States. I would say that there's three really prominent forms of Christian supremacy right now in the US. One is what we would call radical traditionalist Catholics. That's the J.D. Vance camp. And that's kind of a masculine manosphere kind of space. There's the Reformed Reconstructionists, often just called the kind of Calvinist Theo Bros group. And that's the Pete Hegseth kind of coalition, centered around especially Doug Wilson in Idaho. And then there's these independent charismatic networks. And all of those are jockeying for position, and they all have slightly different agendas that they're trying to push through in the Trump administration. But they all also can get together on being anti-abortion, anti-LGBTQ, pro-teaching of Christianity in public schools. So they've got a lot of runway where they're all together. We go down pretty far down the road, and you'll see some real divisions emerge. Right now, Trump is holding them all together just because they all like him.
Okay. All right, well, our next guest is waiting. So if you all could join me in a nice round of applause for Matthew Taylor. Thank you so much, Matthew. We appreciate you.
Thank you all.
And I hope that our paths cross again soon. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and move on. Our tech team is going to go ahead and connect us with our next speaker. And I am going to introduce them. Talia Lavin is the author of the critically acclaimed books, Culture Warlords and Wild Faith. She is a journalist who has had bylines in The New Yorker, The New Republic, The New York Times Book Review, The Washington Post, and more. She writes a newsletter, The Sword and the Sandwich, which is featured in Best American Food and Travel Writing 2024. So take a moment and let's welcome Talia with a nice round of applause, please. And then I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you. Perfect. Thank you to the tech people for making everything run smoothly.
Hello. Hi, everybody. So glad to be both here and not here. Schrodinger's speaker. And I'm delighted to have a chance to chat with you about my new book. It's always an interesting thing to be a Jew writing about Christianity, and especially writing about the Christian right. I think, unlike Matthew, I don't identify as a Christian because I was raised um, Jewish and not just any kind. I was raised an Orthodox Jew, so in a very stringent iteration of the faith, which I subsequently left. And of course, there are many books about the subject of Christian nationalism that have come out in recent years, in proportion to the threat that's rising and its anti-democratic nature, and the power it's accrued over the last half century of the ascension of the Christian right. Um, and I think, what I brought to this project, in addition to the sort of tabula rasa of not being raised with my own personal Jesus, um, and kind of thus coming to it um, without kind of my own version of, well, this is what a Christian is and this is what a Christian should be, and to sort of reprimand my interlocutors with, was also just, I too was raised in a very stringent faith, and so one of the two sort of principal methods I used in compiling the book Wild Faith was, one, I interviewed about 150 or more current and former evangelicals, much more canting to the former evangelicals just because of the nature of the work and the book. And the other was really looking at these internal texts, these texts for internal consumption. So parenting guides, marriage manuals, books of prophecy and prophetic um, prediction, demonology books, and I have found those to be some of the most useful texts in interrogating what precisely the Christian right is and what it wants. Of course, as Matthew and other speakers have elucidated, it's a disparate group, but their political goals are consonant. And as such, they've managed to work together quite astoundingly well, particularly over the last decade or two, as we've watched, the pretense of any firewall between church and state really fall away. And sometimes I do talk to folks who are sort of shocked or astounded by this, or have the sense of, well, but isn't there a wall between church and state? And I'm like, well, for who? If you're a woman in Idaho, if you're a woman in Arkansas, if you're a woman in Texas, there really isn't. And there's very, if you're a trans kid in any number of states, well, no, there isn't. And you know, presumably, like, and there isn't much of an attempt to conceal the theocratic rationale behind these laws. One example that I bring up a lot is um, a law that was passed in Oklahoma a couple of years ago, that gave a criminal penalty to anyone aiding in youth gender transition, and it was entitled, it's informal nickname, or rather, the nickname it was given in press releases was the Millstone Act. And that, as some of you are probably familiar with, is from a verse in the New Testament saying that anyone who leads my children astray should have a millstone tied around his neck and be cast into the sea. So, this is directly from the Bible, it's directly from the New Testament. And this is a very clear example of the ways in which this militantly socially conservative, militantly sort of like violent, this violent enforcement of these rigid gender roles is inherently religiously infused. I thought that was a very vivid example, certainly. And the other piece of the book that I think makes it stand out, but also just something that I have perceived you know, perhaps in the way that like when you learn a new word, all of a sudden it pops up everywhere. When you posit a theory, a political theory behind or a theory behind political events, you know, rationales for it pop up all over the place. But one thing that I really focused on in my research, um, and something that sort of came to me as something that was prominent, um, is the role of child abuse in evangelical communities. So if you look at, you know, and the sort of key figure among the many other specters of the 80s and 90s that have come back to haunt us is James Dobson. So James Dobson rose to power. Many of you, in the spirit of knowing your enemy, um, are probably familiar with it, with him and with his focus on the family ministry, which indeed, to the detriment of many families, he did focus on families. He's a child psychologist who rose to fame with the publication of his book, Dare to Discipline, because in essence, um, he was the tip of the spear of a backlash against the youth-led movement of the youth-led social progress movements of the 1960s. You know, these were movements led by students. The anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, feminist movement, gay rights movement, right? So the part of the um, a big part of the the backlash uh against this youth-led movement toward social progress among the hidebound religious right um was this movement towards biblical parenting, is the term for it. You know, slap biblical in front of a whole lot of things and you get essentially a regression to cruelty, or even um a theologically justified and mandated agenda of cruelty. So Dare to Discipline came out in 1970, followed up by such classics as The Strong-Willed Child, meaning the child whose strong will were mandated to defeat. Um, and many, many other pastors, laymen, and Christian parenting gurus have followed in Dobson's footsteps. And so what Dobson and the biblical parenting movement, what they recommend for kids is what I can only describe as a regimen of psychologically tormenting violence. They lay out this sort of ritualized violence against kids, um, in which corporal punishment stands at the absolute center. They advocate for corporal punishment from a very young age. Dobson is relatively conservative, small c, in his recommendation of beginning to strike your children physically from the age of 15 months. Other gurus, such as the notorious Michael and Debbie Pearl, authors of To Train Up a Child, advocate from as long as 3 months, or if your infant is suckling too greedily or crying too hard, to tug them to tug the infant's hair. So, you know, this is really it's a very Calvinist perspective. These books talk a lot about the inherently sinful nature of man, and that, you know, as soon as a child is born, it begins to manifest that sinful nature, so that babies are crying not because they're babies, but because, you know, and they have no speech, but because of, you know, their sin, their greed, which is unredeemed. And so this view of the child as sort of a miniature repository of sin is very much borne out in this philosophy of biblical parenting. And I spoke to many survivors of this sort of childhood, um, which entailed absorbing a lot of pain on a lot of people's behalf. Many of these people grew up in evangelical communities where these texts were handed to their parents, as soon as pregnancy was announced. So that, and, it was very much expected that the sort of corporal punishment would be applied. Now, the numbers of people who identify as, white evangelicals, they fluctuate. It's sort of conservative estimates are about 14 million people. And within that group, according to recent surveys, about half of that group support corporal punishment to varying degrees of enthusiasm. So that's millions of kids at the least. And one of the arguments I make, and one of the arguments that I think is really salient when we talk about the Christian right, and particularly its eager embrace of authoritarianism, is that this is an authoritarian family model, particularly if you couple that with a study of these marriage manuals that continually and constantly and vividly talk about the necessity of the wife submitting to her husband and the children submitting to their parents, submission and obedience being the absolute watchword of family relations. Many of you are probably familiar with the somewhat absurd, but nonetheless extremely popular, like a diagram given out by Bill Gothard, the since discredited due to a sex scandal, but nonetheless horrifically influential founder of the Institute in Basic Life Principles. He was a mainstay in Christian education for decades, and he has this diagram of sort of there's the umbrellas of protection where it's like Christ is the top umbrella, and then husband, then mother, and then children are sort of beneath the mandate of the mother. Of course, and the reign is labeled destruction. This isn't really how umbrellas work. It's a very inefficient umbrella system. A tripartite umbrella would be redundant at best and would blow over at worst, but it nonetheless sort of describes this kind of how like viciously hierarchical this sort of system is, where you have the husband as ultimate authority and intercessor between his family and Christ, and the wife as submissive co-enforcer of discipline over the children. And so one way of reading this diagram and the vision laid out in these generations worth, 50 years worth of parenting manuals and marriage manuals, is that their vision of the family, bolstered by some very selective reading of the book of Proverbs, which is usually considered relatively minor in the biblical canon, but because it mentions beating your kids, takes on disproportionate gravitas in these child rearing manuals, is that the family is an authoritarian state in miniature. When you are raised with repeated, ritualized child abuse, what you essentially are seeing is constant violence, you are raised to expect violence. You are raised to become inured to brutality. You are raised to be, you are raised to empathize with the aggressor, to view the person hurting you or hurting your siblings as someone with not only might, but righteousness on their side. And you are also raised to believe that pain, love, and punishment, and righteousness all flow from the same font. So if we look at why the Christian right has been so eager to embrace an anti-democratic and authoritarian vision of America, of America's future, I think it would be remiss not to look at the private sphere, the family sphere, as sort of the authoritarian state in miniature. And that's one.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead and finish.
Oh, yeah, just that's one piece, I think that is often neglected and has to be teased out by people who've survived some rough things and have been willing to testify, and whose work and words I was incredibly grateful to draw on in my own.
So I just wanted to, like, I'm not a traditionalist by any means, and so this holiday season, I was kind of thirsty for some either true crime or cult documentaries, or, I mean, I watched like the Menendez brothers documentary, and what I saw through all of it, and I just finished last night with the Boy Scouts child sex abuse cover up, and there's a prominence of religious leaders. So I guess my point is, it is so hypocritical when these folks are talking about protecting children, when the second that they're born, they're telling them that they're born of sin and that they are deserving of punishment, and that their authority figures are the only people that could appropriately deliver that kind of discipline to them. So I guess how can we combat, like, when we're dealing with book bans, or we're dealing with the barring of comprehensive sex ed, and all justified by saying we want to keep kids safe, when we know that they're doing exactly the opposite? How can we combat that?
Yeah, I mean, to seize on the first part of your question anyway, I think hypocrisy is certainly a valid observation, but it's rarely a good counter, when it comes to people whose actions are motivated by uh, either religious, conspiratorial, or religious and conspiratorial zeal. Because the heft of an accusation of hypocrisy comes from the the person leveling the accusation. In other words, if you're talking to someone who views you as a heretic, or helplessly misled, or so on, and so on, as people indoctrinated in this fashion tend to view their enemies. Um, an accusation of hypocrisy is like being accused of, you know, um, like I'm trying to come up with a good metaphor, sorry. It's like being accused of like shiftiness by like a cat. I mean, or whatever. We to them are just not credible interlocutors, much less morally weighty interlocutors um, whose accusations of hypocrisy have weight. And um, similarly, when your goal is the attainment of as much power as possible, accusations of hypocrisy are sort of very easy to brush aside. That being said, you're obviously right in the sense that yes, like so much of this nefarious agenda is really pushed forward under the guise of like, let's protect children, save the children, and so on, and has been for many years. When, among other things, um, uh, among other things, not teaching children anything about sex means that they can't recognize when they're being sexually abused and don't have words for it. Often, what children are being quote unquote protected against is any vision of gender and gender roles and sexuality that falls outside a very narrow prescribed frame. Something that I describe as kind of a Procrustean bed of gender. Again, the submissive woman, the masculine authority of the man, and the submissiveness of the child. And of course, in a not just heteronormative, but hetero-mandatory framework. So, part of what's being protected against are quote unquote protected against is children being able to envision different kinds of families, different kinds of expressions of gender for themselves. As to how we combat it, I think Matthew, while coming from a Christian perspective, had a very good idea, which is just you counter it by presenting your own moral vision, not necessarily by saying you're hypocrites, you're going against God, you're this, you're that, but saying I don't give you credence. I don't give you credence as a moral guardian. I don't give you credence as champions of morality. Instead, like, here's my own vision, right? That the best, in some sense, the best defense against this kind of army on the march um is under their own sort of very uniform war drums, is to issue forth a joyous cacophony and present our own visions boldly and bravely and with as much strength as we can muster.
Well, I think that's really good advice. And it goes along with our theme, building coalitions, working in spaces where we don't normally work, like having a secular summit in a church and stuff like that. So if you join me, please, in thanking our guest, Talia Lavin, for joining us today with a round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate you. Yeah, we appreciate you.
Thank you for having me. And yeah, if you want to read about far-right politics and sandwiches, you can check out my newsletter.
Sounds good. All right, with that, folks, now we're a little bit behind schedule. So lunch is going to be in Smith Hall. As I stated before, you can go right out here down the elevator if you don't want all those steps. There's a spiral staircase right there. And then there's this long walkway over there. So if you go ahead and just go down that way and then go to your right, you will see where the signs are for Smith Hall. So we'll take a moment to eat, and then after that, we're going to be joined by Representative Stephanie Stahl Hamilton. All right.
So, Lindsay, we are seeing it, but I'm not hearing it.
Yeah, I'm having trouble getting my sound to work. I'm gonna start over here in a sec.
Okay, I can share as well if that would help.
Do you want to try? I'm having some trouble with my
Yeah,
Canva.
let me go up and grab the link again.
Thanks, Ian.
Are you currently sharing? I mean, you may need to stop.
Yeah, I think I can actually get it to work now. Hang on one sec.
Oh, okay.
No, still not.
No.
Okay. Well, darn it.
So the problem is that I'm not seeing options for even sharing sound. I
Okay.
don't. I'm
I'll
like
just
that's
play it without sound.
okay.
People can choose their own music that they like.
Yeah, it's like this is set up weird or something. I don't
All
know. I
right.
don't know what's going on.
All right. Thanks for your patience, everybody online. Hang on for a photo show.
Yo. Ian, Angela wanted me to tell you hello. Can you hear
Oh,
me?
cool. Yeah.
Because they can see you, and they wanted you to know that. It's very important.
Okay.
Anytime. Anybody else want to say hi to Ian while we're here? Yeah. Or Stephanie, myself, and then awards. Oh, she said 40 something. Yeah. All right, online people, just so you know, we're waiting a little bit here as our in-person folks travel the trek from Smith Hall to the sanctuary. So give us about 5 more minutes or so, and we'll go back to our programming. Yeah, I'll just leave one on so that when, yeah. Yeah, so I can walk around if we need to. No. Yeah. Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Here comes somebody right now. It's okay. I think we're gonna get started again, folks. I know there's some people that are coming back up from Smith Hall. And again, if you'd like to take some food or snacks or drinks or anything, so you don't have to cook dinner tonight, by all means, feel free to do that. Okay, let me get back to my script here. Okay, are we ready online? Online people, are we ready?
I believe so.
I believe so.
Okay, excellent. All right. So for the next portion of our programming today, we are going to be speaking with one of my favorite people in the world. Well, actually, and then we're going to be awarding another one of my favorite people in the world. And in between that, you'll have to put up with me and listen to my gibberish for about 30 minutes. But which is good that you get to go first here because, you know, she's going to knock it out of the park and I'm probably going to put everybody to sleep. So if you are not familiar with Representative Stephanie Stahl Hamilton, she is a representative from the Tucson area and serves in Legislative District 21. She holds a BA in Christian education and earned her Master of Divinity at Princeton Theological Seminary. She's an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church. Some people may be surprised that an ordained minister consistently scores the highest on our secular scorecard every single year, but that's a fact. And during the 2023 legislative session, Representative Stahl Hamilton was even censured for standing up for the separation of religion and government. So please help me welcome Representative Stahl Hamilton.
Thank you. It is a treat to be with you today. A little bit more about me. I am the wife of a public educator, the mom of 3 almost grown children. We are slowly launching them into the world. I've got 2 boys and a girl. My daughter is a senior. She is our baby. And I've done a number of things in my life and certainly have. The reasons I ran for office are not what I found myself doing when I was elected. I ran on a platform of education and healthcare because, well, my husband's a public school teacher, and it was very hard to raise a family of 3 children and 2 adults on a teacher's salary. All the while, I really wanted to be present and available to my children and pour into them what I could. And finding affordable, quality, accessible health care was very difficult for my family as well. And as I started looking around, noticing, you know, I surely couldn't be the only parent struggling to make ends meet. And with all of the privilege that I had, I just thought, how are families who have less access to what I do, how are they making it in the state of Arizona? And so at some point I started paying attention and realized that for quite some time, the state of Arizona was balancing its budget on the backs of children. And that, I started thinking about that, and with all of the work that I had done, my calling and training was to serve and work with children and teenagers, and in doing so, working with the families. And it wasn't until I took a field trip, my very first field trip. I drove up from Tucson. I had never been to the Arizona legislature. I had no idea how to get there, where to park, where I was going. But I did it. I managed it. I figured it out. And at some point in our day, we were given a tour of the House floor. And I had an opportunity to get on that floor and look around and find my current representatives at that time and snap a little selfie. And one of the things I started noticing were Bibles on desks. And I thought my brain was going to short circuit. I immediately started asking, well, I first snarkily thought, wow, somebody's awfully pious. You know, they have a Bible on their desk. I was like, that's not necessary. But then the more I started looking around and saw that that was a current theme, you know, and the Bibles were there with other things on desks, I really became very troubled and thought, where is the separation of church and state? Well, so as the wheels were turning, then the former minority leader came out and talked to us and said, oh yeah, we start every day with prayer and pledge. At that point, I thought I had lost my mind. Because then I thought, well, who's praying? And what prayers are they praying? And why are we praying? So that day started something in me. And that, wow, well, maybe perhaps I could run for office. And it was one of the few things, but the other piece was, I thought, gosh, there's all these Bibles on desks, and yet I can't feed my family. I cannot get health care for my children. Are we reading the same book of Scripture? Because last time I checked, we were told to take care of the children. And then you start looking at all of the other things. And it just was so baffling. And so I thought, well, I got a dog in that fight. If we're going to have Bibles on desks, let me go and have that conversation. And it was in some ways very naive thinking, but it was something that started in me, the thought that maybe perhaps I could run for office. And then when I was elected in 2020, began my term in 2021, I spent that first year listening to all the prayers. And fortunately, we were, before vaccines, the COVID vaccine. So I had a mask over my face, and that was a good thing because I have never been accused of having a poker face. And I think the only way you could tell I was so frustrated was by watching my eyes roll and the little noises I would make during prayer. I could not stand quietly and respectfully with those prayers. I just could not respect them. And it really frustrated me. And I did it for the first year. I attended the Speaker's Bible Study for the first year because I wanted to learn, and I kept thinking, I got a dog in this fight. And after that, I decided it was time to have just some, I peacefully protest. I don't go onto the floor until after the prayer has been said. And folks are like, well, why don't you say? And I'm like, nope, we shouldn't have any kind of prayer. What if people who don't pray, who don't have a faith, who don't feel compelled to pray, where are their First Amendment rights? Where is the separation of church and state for them? And so I think for me, out of the greatest part of respect, I just don't participate. I don't, my colleagues in my caucus sometimes get a little bit antsy about that and wonder if they're doing the wrong thing. I'm like, no, you got to go do you, but this is the line I draw. And so that's a little bit of how I got to the ledge, the focus that I bring with me into the legislature. So many stories along the way of why I have more than doubled down on my practice and staunch belief of the separation of religion and government. Jeannie, I thought you've got a couple of questions you were gonna, before I take all the time.
Yeah, well, I wanted you to speak to, if you could, because you're not the only religious leader there. You're not the only ordained minister, pastor, whatever. So could you maybe speak to who the other religious leaders are and the difference between, say, your ideology and theirs?
Sure. And my first year I was, and that was kind of a fun thing, being the only ordained minister. And I never hid that fact, but I never led with it either. I was there as an elected official, but during the pandemic, we heard a lot of legislation. Folks were really angry about churches being told to, go remote or, protect their people. I don't know. And so as a clergy person, then I was outed, if you will, in asking to speak from the mindset of a clergy, and a lot of heads swiveled my way when I was introduced to the chamber as an ordained minister. But the following year, there was a vacancy, and there is a representative from the district that kind of runs alongside of mine through 3 different counties, who was appointed to the seat and has since won re-election twice now, who is an minister. I don't know his congregation's ordination. I don't know what but he is a minister of a small, I would say it's a conservative evangelical Bible church. And he certainly has come in with and works God talk into a lot of things, and he'll talk about mercy and justice, mercy in a framework of turning a blind eye, as it were, to rights that need to be, or wrongs that need to be righted, or punishments that need to be dispensed. And he talks about justice in the ways of punishment. And of course, I have tried several times to say, look, you don't get justice without mercy. And that's what justice is, and it has to go through mercy. So let's back up and, anytime we talk about reproductive freedom, we get a long lecture from him. And then this last Easter Monday, I don't know how many of you follow the news, that was his whole screed during the prayer time when he just went uncorked, because Easter happened to fall on Trans Day of Visibility. And he took that as an opportunity to as a bully pulpit, to really come down and just, I don't know what else to say, but villainize trans people. It was awful. It was very uncomfortable. It certainly very unnecessary, and an abuse of his position, and both as an elected and as a minister. And with him, he was appointed in 2022, and then 2023, another member of their caucus, who is an African-American preacher, was elected. And so they have two evangelical pastors in their caucus. And in 2023, we have another ordained a woman in our caucus who is a Black woman, Representative Cruz. And so, and she's with the AME Church. So you've got two mainline Protestant women who are ordained in our caucus, and then two male evangelical conservatives in their caucus. And both Representative Cruz and I have taken to quoting scripture at them. We're like, if you're going to throw that out there, we're going to come right back at you. And even that just makes me uncomfortable, because we should not be legislating theology. But if they're going to use the language, they better be prepared for an argument to come right back at them. And Rep. Cruz, she is no shrinking violet. I adore her. But in all of that, when I was censured for my peaceful protest of the separation of church and state, it was the two ordained ministers that put their names on the ethics complaint from their caucus that brought the charge against me.
Listening to everything you had to say. Okay, I had a question that I think you kind of already answered, so I'm going to go to my next one. What is the best way? Because raise your hand if you've ever been to the Capitol and like sat, oh wow, this is a great group. It's horrible, right? It's pretty much terrible. It's awful. It feels violent.
Yes, very violent.
The way that it's structured. Last year, when we had a one-seat majority in each chamber, now we've got, what, 2 in one and 1 in the other, or 2 and 2?
So it's, well, now, yeah, you have to get 2 votes in the Senate and 4 votes in the House.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we lost 2 seats in the House and 1 seat in the Senate.
So chances are, now that they have an even greater majority in both chambers, they haven't been great about playing together nicely in the sandbox. I don't think that this ratio is going to encourage them to do so. I think they're going to be a lot more harsh. So my question is, what is the best way for constituents to engage with their legislature when the evangelical extremists seem to become more extreme every year? What methods should their constituents use to get them to hear their voices?
you know, I wish I knew, because even a duly elected colleague who got there the same way they did, our voices aren't typically heard. And so I think what we're talking about is a power dynamic. And Greg and I were just having this conversation that I am very rooted in who I am and how I show up and the power that I have. And so I think voice is one way, vote is another. But in between all of that and the structure are so many ways to find power. And I think for me, when I show up and I'm prepping for committee and I'm prepping for floor, you know, I have my computer open and I have the request to speak tab open. And that is when I look at any piece of legislation, I go there first. Because all depending on who is sponsoring, who's weighed in on that legislation, and it doesn't necessarily matter the numbers. I am looking for organizations, I'm looking for names. And when I see the names of people who I've had conversations with, who I've exchanged emails with, it does two things. One, it informs me on that policy, and especially if it's people I trust and who that I've had good conversations with, and I trust them, their stances, their perspectives. So I look to see what the comments are. I look to see who's weighed in. I look to see what the comments are. And secondly, y'all have to know how much wind that puts in my sails. So much of what happens at the legislature is not accessible to the general public. You know, I expect the stakeholders, I expect the lobbyists, I expect the organizations to weigh in because they all have government liaisons that are paid to pay attention. But when the everyday person who is just representing themselves, you know, weighs in on any policy and then perhaps takes an extra minute to put comments down, it grabs my attention and it puts wind in my sails because I think, okay, they're paying attention. Thank God. I'm not just here spitting in the wind with my voice and my votes. Somebody is paying attention. And it, in so many ways, helps me keep my head in the game. It helps me go the distance because let me tell you, you know, there are days we leave feeling like we've been kicked in the gut because of the cruelty, because of the violence. And you gotta shake that off, go to bed, do what you need to do, get up, put your big girl pants on and go back in and do it all over again. And when I look into the request to speak, or if people have weighed in and in my inbox, my email, or if somebody's called, I thought, oh, they're paying attention. I need to show up. This is the job I was elected to do. It's what I said I wanted to do. I want to be here. I need to show up, and I need to do everything I can to make a public record of this. And that's so you have to know if it doesn't feel like people are paying attention, or if you putting in a comment or weighing in on request to speak or sending an email, it may not change the mind of who you hope it will change. It certainly helps me continue to go the distance. You know, I know my purpose, why I'm there, but sometimes I can get lost in just the weightiness of it all and the ugliness. And that just helps me refocus and reconnect with my purpose and to keep going. So I want to toss that out there, that I don't do anything without looking at request to speak. And for a long time, we used to quote the numbers of, you know, like 595 people have weighed in against this piece of legislation as opposed to the one person who has said yes. And you know the majority party is standing with that one person who says yes. It used to be 10 phone calls and it would kill legislation, but that was at a time when things were a lot more moderate, when the Republicans had a supermajority and there wasn't as much of the disproportionate representation that we're seeing now with the extremists. And I think the extremists are so much more emboldened to just get on with whatever their agenda is. And so, you know, for those of us who know why we're there and we know who we are working for and fighting for, knowing that there are folks out there who are standing in solidarity with us and cheering us on and sharing your thoughts and your perspectives, it helps us keep our head in the game. And in doing so, you know, as we go through the process, there are opportunities to, I don't want to say get our licks in, but to move the needle. And if I've got a 30, so for example, the last session was appointed to Ledge Council. It's an occasional committee, and you only see it every 2 years, because when the representatives and senators are appointed to Ledge Council, it's for the purpose of deciding the language that goes into the booklets for the ballot referrals. That's our job, is to argue over that language. And last year we had a pretty big referral in Prop 139, right? That was to enshrine the right to abortion in our Constitution. And we went into Ledge Council knowing that we were going to have some big conversations around that piece of legislation. And we didn't have the numbers to get the correct language. And there is a template for how we are supposed to craft that language. The regular Ledge Council crafts it, brings it to us, and with our help, the legislators appointed to that committee, the Ledge Council committee, we debate the language, but we have a template, and it has to be non-biased, non-partisan, and it cannot hint at, it can't provoke a response one way or the other. It is really just supposed to be very neutral. And when we started debating that language for Prop 139, and I'm just going to have to, I hate talking about parties, but in order to be explicit, the Republican Party had put in the language describing what Prop 139 would do. It talked about a fetus in terms of an unborn human. Thank you. That is the correct response. Because that is language that is expressly used in these conversations about reproductive freedom and reproductive justice. The language of unborn human has been entered into the conversation from a religiously biased perspective. So for me, that's a hard stop. And, you know, I was listening to the back and forth. The lawyers got up and said why they disagreed with that language. I made the amendment to change it to fetus, because that is the medically accurate terminology. And we're talking about a medical procedure, healthcare. And all of that language was anticipated from my end, fell on deaf ears. But as I listened to the back and forth, I thought, oh, I should, and the Speaker of the House at that time was on Ledge Council and was the chair of the committee. And so I thought, oh, I need to get in this conversation. And I asked him, I got a chance to, my turn to talk. And I said, well, Mr. Speaker, as I'm listening to you, and you have expressed that you believe it's your job to protect an unborn human. He said, but would you protect a developing fetus? Well, he didn't want to touch, yes, he did not want to touch the word fetus, because that has been politicized in his mind, even though it's a medically accurate term. And he stopped, and the whole room got quiet, and he was like, wait, what? That was what he said, wait, what? I thought, oh, Mr. Speaker, this is very dignified, wait, what? And I said, yes. As we're looking at this language, why wouldn't you support the terminology developing fetus? And in that moment, he got so frustrated. He exploded and he said, I am Rep. Stahl Hamilton. I am not a medical professional. I don't care what the medically accurate terminology is. But right there was my leverage. Yep. We got him, and we got the public record that was used against him in court, because a lawsuit came immediately, and the stakeholders were there, the lawyers were there. That was the power I had, and I took it. Now, we didn't win the votes on all of that, but it did a couple of things. It provoked him to explode, because he knew he wanted to stay away from that term fetus. And when you say developing fetus, it just, so it's subtleties, it's nuance, but boy, oh boy, did I feel like I won the lottery. You know, that really felt very powerful, and I felt really good. That one thing I did, but we pushed the needle, and obviously it didn't matter. You know, the prop passed. We knew the weight was behind passage of that, and I think some of that was they were anxious going into that, and they really knew they needed to push as hard as they could, and as they were pushing, yeah, Greg, you've got a question. Oh no, right in front of Greg. Yes.
Wait, hold on. Let's get the microphone over there.
Yeah.
Hold on, just a sec. Here you go.
Well, I was just going to say, you said, oh, maybe it didn't matter. It did matter. It mattered a lot. So thank you.
Thank you. But that's what I'm saying to you all, right? You know, when you show up or when you write and when you email and it feels like it's falling on deaf ears, there are those of us who need those comments. We are paying attention, and it helps me keep my focus and keeps me rooted and grounded 100% as to why I am there. So that Jeannie, I hope that answers the question.
No, I think it does. And I think it's a good example too of how, you know, we need to have people who can think on their feet and be nimble. You know, you were also able to help with the repeal of the 1864 abortion ban because you were thinking about repealing that before the session even started, right? In a bill that never even got a committee hearing. And I want to talk about that really briefly because Oliver was there when they were debating the satanic display bill, and testifying in those rooms is kind of scary. But you have people from the public who are very passionate about whatever the issue is, whether it's the satanic displays, education, healthcare, et cetera. But how do you counsel them to preserve their own well-being? Because the way that those senators attacked the members of their own constituency was absolutely abhorrent and downright abusive. So how do you prepare people for testifying in committee, and does that work?
No, I think that I 100% you're right. That it is very abusive, and the level of respect. I have broken protocol in committee and have absolutely called a point of order, and without being acknowledged, given a tongue lashing to members to say that we will respect our guests who show up. I mean, so that doesn't answer your question, but it triggers me, and I do everything I can to, at least among the members and my colleagues, to remind them. I try to put a human face on everything and call people to acts of compassion and kindness. Now, when we know that there are going to be hot topics and hard issues debated and discussed, you know, we do ask people to show up and testify. The public, and it is so very hard, but in doing so, I don't just make the invitation. I will also give the framework of, you need to hear, I know what I'm asking of you. And what will happen when you show up to testify is that you will not be treated kindly. And you will not be respected. And if anything, all right, I have to watch my language. We are in a sanctuary. Grown adults think nothing of it to bully our children who show up to testify. And nothing makes my blood boil faster than that. And so typically I try to lay the landscape, and then I will say, so I have asked you to show up into this ugly environment. And please know that your mental well-being and health is the most important. And if you do not feel comfortable, that is perfectly fine. That is an acceptable, responsible answer. I'm not asking anybody here to be a martyr, because that's not what we need. We need people who can engage at all different levels, whether it's at the legislature or apart from the legislature. And we all have to do, and I think in the coming 4 years, we all have to do what we need to do to preserve ourselves, to care for ourselves, so we can be in a space of fueling a resistance. So that's one thing that I do. And when people do show up, a lot of times I will try to get on my microphone and thank them, point out what I find to be bold and courageous, which reiterates their points and also puts my colleagues on notice that they're behaving poorly. And then afterwards, I will check in with the people. I tend, it's the framing, it's trying to be present in the moment, and then scolding if necessary, my colleagues, but also then checking in afterwards. I have often said to groups that I speak with, and whether I'm on the campaign trail or not, that, what do we do when things get tough? Well, things have really gotten tough since, I would say, 2015. And it's hard. It is hard to get up in the morning, get dressed, and head out into the world just knowing the state of affairs. But what I have found is that what is most important is that we come together, that we remind each other of our humanness, and that we hold one another. So we need to come together, even when it feels like everything is, a dumpster fire, or more so, when there is the cruelty, when children are being ripped away from their parents and housed in cages. We have got to come together, because it is in the coming together that we draw strength from one another, and that we are reminded of our humanness and our connectedness. And that is critical, because as long as we remain human and connected, it is so much harder to take our power away from us. And then we hold hands, because that's what keeps us together and keeps us from getting lost. And we take turns, because we cannot do all the things 100% of the time. We have got to rely on each other to tag in and tag out as necessary to care for one another, because we have got to be at this for a really long time.
I think that is actually probably the best closing message that you could give us, are there any questions here? Anybody? Okay. Wow, can we just give Stephanie Stahl Hamilton a round of applause, please? Thank you so much. And how grateful are we that she is one of our elected officials at the legislature, right? Yeah.
Jeannie, I see you have one of my campaign stickers on your water bottle.
I do, yeah.
It has been a treat to be with you all. I always enjoy when I get asked to meet with you all and to connect. I have to dash. My daughter is just right up the road at a volleyball tournament, and they are wrapping up soon, so we are going to be heading back to Tucson. But thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention, your questions, and y'all just keep on going, man. It's important.
Thank you so much, Representative. Thank you. And you'll have to let us know how your daughter's volleyball team did. We're almost finished right now with our programming. It's me. How many of you were at the Humanist Society last month when I spoke? Oh, good. So for some of you, this might be a little bit of a repeat. If we could get the slides up for that presentation, that would be great. And I know that we're running behind, so I appreciate everybody's grace since we kind of ran over on some of the things today. Are they still here? Oh, good. Here we go. Perfect. All right. All right, here we go. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So I gave a talk at the Humanist Society of Greater Phoenix last month about, the impending shit show that we are about to encounter. And I titled it Rage Against the Fascist Machine. This is not a drill. So go ahead and go to the next slide. Probably fairly quickly. You all know, if you're here right now, you know what we do. These QR codes will take you to various places, so if you'd like to, by all means, feel free to scan them. But yeah, we are focused on issues. We're a nonpartisan organization. We do not endorse candidates. We really just focus on the issues. We also provide advocacy at the Capitol, grassroots lobbying, coalition building. I work with several different nonprofits and government agencies across the state,
pretty much on a weekly basis throughout the year so that we can strategize and fight against this kind of evangelical extremism. As you heard earlier, Dianne Post handles our legal complaints, and she's busier than she's ever been. And then we also have events, in person, hybrid, and our Friday Rage Fests. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So yeah, a lot of the events that we have, the Friday discussions. How many of you have attended our Friday discussions over Zoom? They're on Zoom, so if you're not familiar with that, you might want to check it out. We had an hour-long discussion earlier, what was it? No, it was like in 2023 with Matthew Taylor, where he was able to really dig in and answer a lot of questions. So if you enjoyed hearing him speak today, you'd probably really enjoy the hour-long segments that we have with authors, historians, journalists, you name it. Let's see. We've also been promoting support for school board candidates because a lot of these legislators who work alongside Stephanie and other elected officials at the Capitol, many of them got their start at school boards. And you better believe that since about, I would say 2018, 2020, 2022, and this last election, we're seeing in some cases a MAGA extremist takeover of our suburban schools, mostly suburban and rural schools, I would say. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. We also have a Substack publication. This is my way of getting out my anger, I guess, my frustration, my disbelief, because the things that are happening at school board meetings are pretty terrible. And just as Representative Stahl Hamilton said, the things that are said in those meetings are pretty awful. Very transphobic, homophobic, misogynistic, scripture being read, all kinds of things. So our school board meetings really are where it's at. And if you're interested, I can help you and get you plugged into your local school district. We also are taking outside contributions from for our Substack publication. So if you would like to write and you have information, especially if you're in those rural spaces where we don't hear from people as much, where they don't have local news media anymore, by all means, feel free to reach out to us and we'd be happy to publish you if it aligns with our mission, vision, and values. Go ahead and go to the next slide. There was a reason for this slide. Perhaps I could look at my script. So let's see. I spoke actually recently in my latest Substack where I talked about how society has embraced some really dystopian tropes of late. I really struggled after the election and almost for the entire month of November. I was going through all the phases of grief, Then we had those events that took place in South Korea, what's happening in Syria, what's going on in Brazil, Sudan, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine. And now we've got this incoming dictator on day one and his regime of billionaires. Last count, I think he's got 14 proposed billionaires for his cabinet. So we're really living in the worst timeline ever. And that's where this comes from. You got yourself a stew going on. I mean, especially from what the speakers said today, that this kind of, religious nationalism is really not just happening here in the United States. It is happening not just with Christianity, it's happening across the spectrum amongst different religions. And it's a really scary and uncertain time right now. So not only that, but we have income disparity, housing crisis. All of these things are caused by corporate greed, American individualism, skyrocketing healthcare costs, climate catastrophe, and the loss of bodily autonomy and privacy for 50% of the population. And 2025 is set up to be a perfect storm of autocratic chaos, in many cases driven by evangelical extremism and dominionist ideology. So considering that Kash Patel, heading the FBI, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Oh, this is where, I'm sorry, go back, sorry. So this is where I got this article. It's a great article. It's titled How to Survive the Broligarchy. So I basically take the tips and tricks from this article and break them down for you. Okay, now you can go to the next slide, please. So when somebody tells you who you are or who they are, I tend to believe them. We currently have, like I said, about 14 billionaires as cabinet picks. Many of them are sexual abuse enablers. Some have a history of financial fraud, science denialism, violence, almost zero pushback coming from the GOP, except for Gates, because even his own don't like him and he ended up withdrawing. And people even applauded yesterday when they announced his departure from the House of Representatives, which I love for him. So nationally, because we focus really mostly on local issues here and what's happening in our own backyard, but we can't really focus on just one without focusing on the other at this point. And if you'd like to see who is representing you or who represents the various legislative districts throughout the state of Arizona, you can scan this. CEBV, Civic Engagement Beyond Voting, has put together a perfect comprehensive list of every elected official, as well as what committees they serve on and who chairs those committees. So, for example, if we wanted to hear Representative Stahl Hamilton's bill, we would know the committee member that should go in front of, like the repealing of the 1864 ban. They let less than 1% of democratically sponsored bills even get a hearing in our legislature. So, and chances are, even with your emails, they still might not. With your phone calls, they still might not. But if there's at least a record of constituents saying, why are you not allowing this bill to be heard where we would increase the budget for pregnant moms in Medicaid so that they are less likely to get infections while they're pregnant? That's what's good for moms. And so the pro-life party is then forced to hear those kinds of arguments so that these bills can get a hearing. Go ahead and go to the next one, please. So the one thing I do want to point out here, I can't unsee it. Anybody here ever watch Big Love? It was an HBO show about sister wives. The guy had like 4 wives or something like that. And I can't unsee it because Warren Peterson, who's the Senate president, I'm sorry, he looks so much like Bill Paxton from Big Love. And like I said, I can't unsee it. That's the real senator. That's the pretend one. Go ahead and go to the next one, please. So another thing that I encourage all of you to do is stay engaged. These are links to the Arizona Legislature's live videos and their archives. So the live feed is over here, and what happens every day is they'll have a list of who, I'm the only one up here for crying out loud. They'll have a list of the videos that will be, the committee hearing videos that will be posted that day. And then over here, go to the archive meetings. Do that when you go home tonight. Maybe have a beverage, because if you do that, you're probably going to be really pissed off, especially if you're like in the Senate Education Committee, the Government Committee, the Elections Committee, which last I checked, I think is still being run by Senator Wendy Rogers, an election denier. So yeah, that's where we are in our democracy. Go ahead and go to the next one. So what I'm concerned about now is school board extremism. Peoria Unified School District is what I would call a 3-1-1 school board. Typically, school boards have 5 seats. So, when I'm saying 3, I'm talking about like whoever the majority is. And right now, it's evangelical extremists, one of whom is actually suing the district that she's supposed to be serving because she doesn't know how to read silently in her head. Literally, she wanted to read scripture out loud rather than, she said, it fortifies me. Well, lady, I'm pretty sure that you could probably do that silently, and then go get on the dais. That's not what these folks want to do. This is all for show, and it's all to erode and chip away that wall that separates religion from government. Some of the things that were recommended by the extremist legislature last year were that school board members should have master keys to all the buildings. I sat on my school board for 8 years, and I know that would have an absolutely, and even though I was a teacher and very pro public education, I knew that, that wouldn't be a good thing for morale, for staff. people might be on edge, walking on eggshells, not okay. They wanted to have their own offices. And that means that they would have access to employees or their very private and personal information. So bad idea. And we'll probably see that again this legislative session. So in that case, we're going to, and you know what? Last year, had it not been for those of us who work in the education space, there were people who are more progressive elected officials who thought it would be a great idea. Oh, you eliminate the middleman, they can just, it means that they're really involved in their school district. No. So we had to kind of coach some folks. So that's part of the work that we do too. Go ahead and go to the next one. Let's see. So whatever you have done in past years, and I see a lot of people here that I know, you run campaigns, you work behind the scenes, you get the data. Some people have run for office themselves, you show up to committee meetings. So whatever you've been doing, it's time for us to basically quadruple that. You need to call your representatives, call your school board, email your reps and your school district board members. It's really important to show up to meetings. Even if you don't speak, sometimes you might be the only connection for that board member or that Representative Stahl Hamilton who's having to sit and deal with these grown men who act like complete toddlers. So even if you just make eye contact with and nod at your elected officials, you have no idea the morale boost that gives an elected official. You can join committees at the schools, like right now, for example, Deer Valley Unified School District. MAGA won there, and they did not renew their override. And so they're looking at cutting $11 to $12 million from their budget. So it's really important to get on these committees or these boards, committees in the schools, whether it's budget, curriculum, because if we've got evangelical extremists, you'll never get comprehensive sex ed out of that committee. And in fact, that's happening right now in Scottsdale Unified, where the extremists were trying to get onto the board and to block an actual MD from being on the board of that committee or being on that committee. So it's really important that we show up for those things. And in fact, Dianne Post, our legal director, she joined the library board in the city of Phoenix. They meet once a month, I think, because think about it. The folks who want to ban books are joining their library boards. So we need to join those boards too. All right, go ahead and go to the next one. Okay, so we are the enemies from within that he was talking about. And by he, I mean, 45/47, whatever. What's going to happen probably in the next 4 years, 2 to 4 years, whatever, we're going to see journalists, writers, publishers, academics. I would include podcasters and influencers to this because it won't only be mainstream media, since many have already obeyed in advance. You might recall that LA Times decided not to endorse. Washington Post recently withheld a political cartoon because they didn't like the message there, and because one of their board members was depicted on the cartoon. So the woman who drew the cartoon, she stepped down and she's on Substack. So beyond that, I would say it's going to be doctors, and this is already happening, right? Doctors, teachers, accountants, then groups like ours, groups like the ACLU, Planned Parenthood Advocates of Arizona, and locally, we've already seen our teachers being demonized, right? Both pre-K to 12th grade, as well as post-secondary, secondary and post-secondary education. They've all been targeted in Arizona really for about 2 decades. How do I know? Because I was a teacher during the last 2 decades. We've got school board members who are just drowning in these MAGA districts who really don't have any support. And they're going to come under greater scrutiny. There's a lot of school board meetings where they have security or police departments there because of the violence that's happened on school campuses at these board meetings. And then what we'll see too is destruction of these organizations, whether it's a school district, a nonprofit. You're going to see a destruction through litigation and prosecution, yes. So currently there's a teacher in the Higley Unified School District who's under police investigation because she was teaching books like The Bluest Eye. Because guess what? She's an AP teacher. And also The Bluest Eye is on the list of approved curriculum for English AP. So we're gonna see more of that. I already see it all the time. I don't know if any of you go to these Facebook pages. I go to a lot of rural ones because I want to see what's going on. But like all the time I see these, asks of people does anybody know of a pediatrician who isn't so rigid in their vaccine ideologies or whatever? And I'm just like, oh my God, nobody's to be trusted. If the lawyer that's giving them advice in their district, if they don't like it, they'll do like they did in Camp Verde and just get rid of that lawyer and find somebody who will agree with them on every count. And then they'll try to find a judge, I guess, that'll agree with them on every count as much as they can. All right, go ahead. So we all know who the real enemy from within is, right? Go ahead and go to the next slide. So another piece from this article, to name is to understand, and I would call this not McCarthyism, but maybe McMuskism. Nationally, what we're seeing is billionaires, tech bros, the broligarchy. We're going to see more and more surveillance. I just was reading a bunch of information yesterday about this AI avatar that I think that her name is Liv, and she's identified as a queer Black woman. Do you know who created her? A bunch of white men. A bunch of white men created her. And so when they were having AI conversations with this chatbot, Liv, they were uncovering, how could you possibly even know what the lived experience is of a queer Black woman since you were created by, and of course she was like throwing out all kinds of racial stereotypes in her conversation about her mom makes really great fried chicken and collard greens. And I mean, it was embarrassing. And that's Mark Zuckerberg, who has donated $1 million to the inauguration, along with a whole bunch of other billionaires. We're gonna see a lot more bots and trolls. And we're gonna see, we already have seen rampant mis and disinformation. Now, locally in Arizona, it's actually abnormal in Arizona when there is no conflict of interest in the legislature. It's like so weird. And my prediction is that we're gonna see even more targeted school board bills that will try to lift up and give more power and voice to school board members because they're pretty confident that they're gonna be able to just pick them off one by one. Special interests, anti-LGBTQ, BIPOC policies through the Arizona Corporation Commission and the legislature, because they now also have a supermajority of extremists on their board as well. Okay. Nationally, what we're going to see is people pushing agendas hard and fast on day one. I expect that we'll see probably a lot of executive orders. We've seen that corporate media is already complacent. I recommend that you get your news from other sources whenever possible. I think organizations will be dismantled or destroyed, including, as they've promised, the Department of Education. I'm very worried about the anti-terrorist bill, or it's about nonprofits, and they're really worried about, people being able to speak out against certain things. So I see them dismantling a lot of things, and I would not be surprised, especially given these two domestic terrorist incidents that have just happened within the past week, that we are going to maybe even, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a false flag incident, is what I'm saying. Locally, I think decorum at our legislature and at school boards that do have extremists in charge are going to, the decorum is just going to get worse. I think there's going to be a suppression of civic engagement. As Stephanie mentioned, you might have 500 people against a bill and one person for it, and they'll say, okay, well, there's so many people here, so we're just going to pick one from each side, and you both have a minute and a half. So even though there's 500 something over here, one person over here, doesn't matter, because they get to make the rules any way they see fit. There's going to be overt pushes for religious curriculum. A couple of incoming board members in Peoria Unified have already promised us that they will be bringing PragerU, Hillsong Hillsdale, thank you. And oh gosh, what's the other one? LifeWise, there's another group. And this is probably in that network that Matthew was talking about, but there is another group that will, kind of help you get that religious curriculum in, LifeWise. They're really prominent in the state of Ohio, which makes sense. And they're making an appearance here. And like I said, people have promised that's what they're going to bring. Go ahead and go to the next one. Next slide, please. Okay. So as so many of the other speakers have said here today, we need to lean into our collective power. So we need all the help that we can get. If you are an expert in law, in public policy, mis or disinformation, or coalition building, please take the time to join our work. Go ahead and go to the next one. Do not comply in advance. I've seen so many people, everybody's Monday morning quarterbacking after the election. And I think one of the most disheartening things that I saw was people within my own party that share my progressive values suddenly punching down, right? And saying, well, if we weren't so woke, or if we hadn't stood up for those trans kids, or, whatever, we can't do that. We can't join our corporate overlords. We have to stand up for the most vulnerable people in our community. So don't punch down. Do not further marginalize the marginalized. And when you see something, say something. Be an upstander. Okay, go to the next one, please. Another piece of advice from this author, know what you stand for and what you think is good. And that comes from Tim Snyder from his book on tyranny. As much as possible, do not support organizations or businesses that support fascism. I'm actually I'm going to be going to Costco more. Their CEO has capped his ratio for his staff, and so I appreciate that about him. I canceled my Amazon subscription. I'm not giving Jeff Bezos my money anymore, as much as I possibly can. And it's not easy to do. It's going to take a lot of research. But as much as you can, support local businesses and not billionaires. I would definitely start securing your data on every single platform that you have, because you can assume that Musk and Zuckerberg are watching your every move. The fact that, he thought it was really a brilliant idea to create this chatbot that was created by a bunch of white men just shows you how out of touch they are. I don't know if you've noticed, but on all of my feeds over the last couple of months, especially, even before that, I saw so much AI generated stuff. I saw so many incendiary, pages I don't even subscribe to. And I have to keep a Facebook account because in order to access the secular AZ one, it's really frustrating. But either way, I'm making sure that that mine is locked down. I block everything that looks like clickbait, trying to get people to fight with each other, because that's what they want us to do. I've also downloaded Signal, and I've turned on my disappearing messages. It's an app on your phone. It works for iPhone and Android. And think of your personal data as if they were nude selfies, and keep those under lock and key. Go ahead and go to the next one. Okay. Make sure that you inform people. I know you're not going to be able to inform the MAGA base, right? As Matthew and Talia said, they're so entrenched in their ideologies, we're not going to be able to change their mind. But if there's somebody else, a work colleague who seems to be uninformed, and it's difficult to do this, right? Because you don't necessarily know. And we've gotten so contentious here, we might be afraid to do that kind of stuff. But the more we engage and the more we dispel information, and really ask questions when people start spouting off about trans people, especially, I'll be like, so tell me, how exactly do the trans folks affect your daily lives? They never have an answer. Well, I'm just afraid. Why? Yeah, it's, so ask those kind of questions. Or immigrants. There's this demonization of anybody who's an immigrant, and when you really ask, so how does it affect you directly? Most of the time they're like, it doesn't really. Even if you can just get that in the door, then you might be able to have a conversation. And I apologize for the scary meme. All right, go ahead and go to the next one. So some things that you could do to stay engaged if you want. We actually have a few vacancies. One of our youngest board member just graduated, and he's looking at what the world has to offer him, which is probably a lot since he's already done 2 White House internships. But that means we've got some vacancies. We do 6 meetings about 6 meetings a year. We do have a give or get financial commitment that's nominal. And if you don't want to necessarily join the board, but you want to join one of our committees, that could be an opportunity for you too. Go ahead and go to the next. Because I know I'm so over time and I don't even have my phone over here with me. Dianne already said this. We need legal help. I'm not going to belabor that anymore. Go ahead and go to the next one, please. And then we have this was from Humanist Society, so I apologize. You're already here for this event, but go ahead and save the date because our day at the Capitol is going to be March 6th, 2025. And then from the beginning of February till, well, really, in the Valley until probably April, we have street fairs, home tours, pride events. And then in the summertime, we also have some rural pride events if you want to get involved that way. Go ahead and go to the next one. And then this, because I feel like Matthew Taylor, I loved his discussion. I really did, but I felt really down a little bit. And Andrew Seidel, I feel like is just a little bit more uplifting with this regard. This is a quote from him. Christian nationalists will not go gently into the obsolescence for which they are bound. This identity was born in the dark corners of their fearful minds, and they are raging against the dying of their privilege. So it does go along with what Matthew said because we saw the numbers, right? The number of people who identify as Christian is definitely going down, but now we have this finely tuned machine that is comprised or compromised of all of these, different Christian nationalist organizations, whether it's Alliance Defending Freedom, Turning Point USA, Moms for Liberty, etc. They're all working together like a well-oiled machine. We don't have that same machinery, but we can at least show up and plug in to those networks where we can maybe find some hope and do good in the world. All right, let's go to the next one. I think that. All right. Okay, so that was it for me. Does anybody have any questions? I know I whipped through that, and I apologize because I was a little bit behind and I started getting in my head and thinking about it. So any questions? Okay, great. All right, because last but not least, this is like probably my favorite part because these are the folks that will give us hope when everything seems hopeless. So I'm gonna go ahead and start with somebody who I consider a good friend. Ann Ordway is president of the Deer Valley Unified School District Governing Board, and you can read all that. She's been a longtime advocate for education and served. But more than that, Ann Ordway is somebody who, from womb to tomb, really is advocating for children. She provides an excellent example of what a strong school board president looks like and behaves like. And she has what I would say is perhaps one of the biggest bullies on her school board. Ann, unfortunately, couldn't be here today, so she's joining us via Zoom. And I just want to speak about that for a second too, because Ann is currently going through chemotherapy treatment. And this board member that she deals with on a regular basis accuses her of faking her cancer. Right, this is like, Stephanie said that they will bully children, they will bully cancer patients too. It's really despicable. But Ann Ordway, like I said, is a true champion of children. She started a boutique closet for students in need. She's been involved in her PTA. She's just amazing. So with that, please give Ann Ordway a round of applause for being one of our secular stars. You want to say something, Ann?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I just wanted to say that everything that I heard today is absolutely scary, and also it inspires us to remember why we do what we do. There's, excuse me, it's been a long day. There's just no one on this earth that is not worth being valued, cherished, and taken care of. And at some point in time, we're all going to change places and be the one that gives, be the one that takes, be the one that receives. So there's just no one that's not worth that. Doesn't matter to me who you are. In a way, what you've said to or about me. Being on a school board is interesting, but you let all of the nonsense and the vulgarity and the insensitivity and the lies fall off of you because you're there for kids. And if we don't stay strong, whether it's a word to someone in a grocery line, or you use your platform, if you have a platform of a formal platform, our children today are not going to have an opportunity to think for themselves and have the opportunity to change their world. I would say that people that are 40 and under have never seen a quote unquote normal political atmosphere. And this is what they've grown up to expect. We have many of them that are trying to change it, not only for themselves, but for what I call the bookend portions of society, which are our children and our elderly. So Jeannie is one of my bestest friends, and imagine why. So all I can say is thank you for noticing. And it's excuse me, it's just nothing that I haven't been doing basically since I've been 5. It just is on a bigger and a larger scale. So anyway, there you have it. Thank you, Jeannie.
Thank you, Anne. We'll have to find a time where I can drop off your award for you. All right, let's give her a round of applause, everybody. All right, Lindsay or Ian, you can actually go ahead and skip the next award winner since they were not able to be here. They're fantastic. I'll coordinate a time where we can drop them off. But for sake of time and because she's been sitting here all day and because she's also another one of my absolute favorite people, I want to talk about Tammy Stoss. Tammy Stoss teaches 3rd grade at the in the Mesa Public School System. She's also the executive director of Arizona Trans Youth and Parent Organization, also known as TYPO, a role in which she has been advocating and educating in Arizona on behalf of transgender and gender diverse youth and their families for over a decade. And I gotta tell you, it was something was going on with AZ TYPO, and Tammy and I sit in on these LGBTQ plus advocacy meetings on occasion once a week when we're actually sitting in those meetings. I'm sitting there and I was actually looking for a picture, and I pull out a picture of my daughter's like pre-K school, and there's her teacher was Miss Jocelyn, but then there was another teacher, Miss Tammy, T-A-M-I, and I was like, oh my gosh, like I didn't put the two things together. We both look different than we did 20 years ago, but it's a very small world, and so Tammy has been doing good work for so long. So come on up, Tammy, and say a few words.
It's not just a small world, it's a small town. Yeah, that was wild. I know, it's like, oh my gosh, I was your daughter's preschool teacher. I'm like honored and humbled and all of this stuff. I've been doing this work for a long time. I got into this work through AZ TYPO. I can tell you a little bit about what AZ TYPO is for those of you all who aren't familiar with it. It stands for Arizona Trans Youth and Parent Organization. And what we do, I say it's more than just me. It's a group of families, and it's a completely volunteer organization that's run by parents of trans and gender diverse youth, supporting other parents of trans and gender diverse youth through support groups and connecting them up to resources.
We are parents who walk the path with our own kids, helping other parents to walk the path with their kids, connecting them up to resources, community, and just basically whatever they need. We've gone through the trials and tribulations with our own kids, and we want to make it easier for them, because we know in the beginning it's a lonely journey. It can be very isolating, and as you know from the ever-changing political climate, it can get even scarier. And so we want to let those parents know that a lot of what you're hearing in the media and out there in the news is a lot of disinformation. A lot of what you're seeing on those news reports, those ads, those political ads, it's not true. Our kids are just like everybody else's kids. And we want to help them understand that it's just, maybe a little different needs that we just need a different doctor to go to, or maybe a little special conversation to have with the principal at school. And so that's kind of what we do with our group. Now, in addition to that work, I also am a teacher, so I work in the education field. I've done a lot of work with other educational organizations in educating educators. In fact, I have a training coming up this next Friday for K-12 educators, pre-service teachers, on how to work with LGBTQ plus kids in Arizona schools. And I do a lot of that work just to, make our kids feel safe in Arizona schools. I was the former chairperson of the LGBTQ plus committee under Kathy Hoffman at the state, down at the State Department of Education, prior to Kathy Hoffman losing heartbreaking loss. And like I said, I've been doing this work for a long time. I don't get paid for this work. I do it because a long time ago, someone took me in, and I still get emotional when I talk about this. Someone took me in and helped me with my son and showed me that my son was just like everybody else, and that my son could have a future just like everybody else. And I pay that debt back every day in the work I do. My son was just married in October, and he and his wife are starting off their future. They live in Massachusetts because he could no longer take the political climate in Arizona. He left the state during the 2020 election because the political ads were too much for him. He was tired of seeing his existence debated in the public arena every single day. He couldn't take it. So one of the things that I try and do is dismantle that campaign of misinformation through teaching communities, teaching anybody who will listen. Basically, if I can get in front of somebody and talk about it, I will get in front of somebody and talk about it and tell you about my family and tell you about the community and tell you about anybody that, in the trans community, and how normal they are and how great they are and how loving they are and how amazing the trans community is and how they are not to be feared. They are amazing, magical, powerful people, and we should embrace them all. And I absolutely love what you said about don't punch down, be upstanders, because we should not be blaming this loss of this election on our trans community, because they came out and fought. They fought harder than a lot of people I know, and they were not the reason we lost this election. So we should thank them. And if you ever get a chance to meet a trans person, or if you want to hear a story of a trans person, catch me after. We'll talk. And thank you. Thank you all so very much.
All right. Well, I appreciate everybody with the few hiccups and everything else, a few delays. I really appreciate you all coming out tonight. As I said earlier, back in Smith Hall, we still have some sandwiches left. So by all means,
Please grab some if you want to grab some for dinner tonight, for lunch tomorrow, that's fine. Normally, we have the Atheists Helping the Homeless who come here and take all of our leftovers, but if you don't take them, they're just going to go to waste. So feel free to do that. That's it. Thank you so much for coming to our Secular Summit this year, everybody. Thank you. And thank you again to Shadow Rock UCC and Pastor Ken for allowing us to share your beautiful space. Thank you. And to the tech people up there too. Thank you.